Okay. And good morning to everyone joining us for the Planning and Regeneration Committee meeting. Apologies for the lateness. It's been a bit of one of those mornings where you don't necessarily feel your best. So I'm going to ask for people's patience and a little bit of love. And hopefully we can get through the agenda on time. And we are really looking forward to hearing from our guests this morning. So for those following us online, please feel free to follow us on Twitter at London Assembly or use the hashtag Assembly Planning for this meeting. And obviously, can I please remind participants, those in the chamber and in the gallery, to silence your devices. Today, we are holding an investigation into the Mayoral Development Corporations and their impact on London. Before we begin, we have a few items of business to attend to. Can I please ask our new committee clerk, Jack Booth, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. There's no apologies for absence.
Thank you. And I think it's probably worth saying here, we have had an apology from one of our guests, Mayor Rokhsana Fiaz. We'll miss her, but I'm sure we'll be able to get some contributions from her in writing after the meeting. Chair, I'd also ask the committee if we could note the list of offices held by Assembly members. Thank you. And can I also ask members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interests in any specific items listed on the agenda? Great. Can we also confirm the minutes of the committee meeting on the 12th of October 2022? Fantastic. And can we also note the completed and closed and outstanding actions arising from the previous meetings? Brilliant. Well, that brings us to our main item of business, as I mentioned, a discussion on the Mayoral Development Corporations and how they have impacted London. As also mentioned, we sort of separated this into two panels. I think the last thing we wanted as a committee is to have a sort of overcrowded panel, and that means that sometimes people are being rushed to give their answers, or it feels as if we don't get enough time to go into the meat of the subject. So we thought that if we presented it into two panels, and then we'll have a sort of closing panel at the end so that we can integrate any of the comments that have been made by the two panels. So we hope that people participating in both panels can stick around for as long as they can in order to make that happen. But thank you very much for our guests joining us this morning. David Lunts, Chief Executive of the Old Oak and Park Royal Development Corporation, Emma Williamson, Director of Planning at the Old Oak and Park Royal Development Corporation, Lynn Garner, Chief Executive of London Legacy Development Corporation, and Paul Brickell, the Executive Director for Regeneration and Community Partnerships in the London Legacy Development Corporation. So many thanks for joining us. It's fantastic to be here with you today. And I'll be kicking us off with the first couple of questions. And I think the first one will be coming to yourself, Lynn. To what extent has the LLDC done what it set out to do?
Thank you, Chair. I think I'll start with the vision of LLDC, which you may be aware concentrates on opportunities to change the lives of East Londoners. And I want to start with business in that regard, because the economy and jobs are so important in that mix. We have two business districts. One is an innovation hub at Here East, and the other is International Quarter London, which is corporate headquarters for many businesses. Obviously, we also have jobs on the park and so on, opportunities for local people. And we've driven around 25,000 jobs to date and have 15,000 to go in terms of our targets, which we'll be achieving over the next 5 to 10 years. Many of those people locally have been able to access those jobs. So around 70% of the park and venues are run by local people. There are opportunities, particularly in turnover, coming from International Quarter London and also through Here East, the Innovation Hub. We also, at LLDC, drive forward social value in a meaningful way. We have been quite innovative in this space across London. So we not only embed socio-economic objectives in Section 106, but through contracts and through leases to ensure that occupiers in the park are driven to our objectives. We've built a construction skills base on the park called Build East, which is in conjunction with Transport for London, has a long-term future potentially being based at the Royal Docks in East London. And we've built the Good Growth Hub, which is essentially a job brokerage place in partnership with the boroughs, where all of the jobs that are arising across East Bank, for example, will be channelled into so that we can get as many local and young people involved as possible in those creative opportunities. This is a complex project. It's multi-layered, and it's had the benefit of having cross-party support over many years. So we have been quite privileged. We haven't done everything perfectly. We would be the first to acknowledge that. But we think we've come a long way in the 10 years since 2012 and delivered something that London could be proud of. Of course, legacy needs to be judged in decades, not just the first 10 years. And we like to think that we've established a strong foundation for the next 10 years for inward investment and growth in East London. I'll stop there, Chair. Take any other questions.
Thank you for that overview, Lynn, and I'm sure that the committee members will be drilling down into more specifics, probably around housing as well.
Yeah.
Lynn, my second question is, what plans did the LLDC put in place to ensure good levels of community engagement, and would you see these plans as having been successful?
Well, most of our success, I would say, has been based on working very closely with communities. And if it's okay with you, Chair, Paul is closest to this, actually, and has been around at LLDC for many years, and indeed many years before that.
Please.
Thank you, Chair. I suppose I'd give you 5 headings, really. And the first is that the park and the venues themselves are... Oh, yes. I knew I'd forget to do that probably every time, but certainly the first time. 5 things. First of all, the park and the venues itself are big community assets. I think we often worry about that and getting the balance between the global destination, if you like, and the local destination right. COVID, when it stripped away all those other visitors, really revealed that the park is a big asset for local communities. So there's those sort of things. The second thing is the number of formal forums that we would have. So the Park Panel, Built Environment Access Panel, and the Legacy Youth Voice and Legacy Youth Board. There are others, but they're the main ones, which is where we sort of formally talk to people, both about the development programme that's coming, but also about service delivery, if you like, and the quality of the park. And what we try to do with those, particularly with Legacy Youth Voice, they're important in their own right as sources of advice, but also they're developmental. And just Monday night we had Legacy Youth Voice launch their new brand, and they invited the alumni back, so we have now 10 years worth of alumni. Lovely to see those young people, some of them making their way, you know, in the development or planning or consultancy sectors, so that's very good. That's the second. The third is we work closely with community organisations to commission research and insight into what's happening in the park and what it means to local communities. Examples of that would be Hackney Quest advising us on planning the Good Growth Hub. We might come, that's about jobs and skills, we might come to that. Citizen scientists who are in the heart of our information gathering in terms of understanding, you know, the prosperity indices in local neighbourhoods. And actually tomorrow we have Badu Sports running an insights programme for local park partners and businesses. I suppose the principle there is, you know, it's all very well paying consultants to come along and kind of relieve local communities of information and their intellectual property. Actually, we rather like to pay local community organisations and local community members to do that research themselves. That's the third. The fourth is we do a large amount of commissioning of local organisations to deliver practical activities. Examples of that would be Badu Sports, Bike Works, London Youth Rowing in the sports arena, sports area, and the Yard Theatre would be another. There are other examples too. So that's us commissioning work, which is often, you know, has practical value, like Badu Sports, for example, running a sports programme. But again, underneath that is a very strong developmental programme. So develop, in that case, developing local young people to become leaders. And then fifth and finally, we have a funding programme for local people. I think one of the things that planning authorities like us now have at our disposal is neighbourhood community infrastructure levy. And so I think we've given, over the last 3 or 4 years, we've given something like £3.7 million worth of grants to local community organisations. I think 45 is our current total organisations to work in local communities in and around the park across the 4 boroughs. And then the second piece of funding is that we established a charity, as you know, with the Mayor called Foundation for Future London, and then we supported them to raise so far £11 million of private sector funding, which is again channelled through the charity FFL in order to fund local community organisations across the 4 boroughs in projects and programmes. So I think those are the headings of, and clearly there's a lot more detail of how we would engage, the ways in which we engage with communities.
That's fantastic, Paul. Thank you. I appreciate that overview. And once again, I think the committee members will probably be drilling down into some more specifics around community engagement, and it will certainly feature quite heavily in our second panel. But for now, I'll pass over to Assemblymember Berry. I think he's going to be taking the third question to OPDC members of the panel.
So, good morning. It is essentially the same question about community engagement. What are you doing to make sure that you've got good community engagement? I recognise you don't have the resources yet that LLDC have for local sill flooding in or anything like that. But are you doing things that help to empower and fund local groups as well as just listening at this stage?
And thanks for the opportunity to come and speak to your committee this morning. Yes, there's a range of different approaches that we're taking, and I think you may be hearing from Aisha John a little bit later on, who's a member of our community review group, which is one of the important ways that we solicit and take notice of community feedback. So the community review group is drawn from a range of local residents and people working in our area. They sit and review planning applications that we receive as the local planning authority. Their contributions and feedback is fed systematically to our planning committee before decisions are made, and they've made some really, really useful contributions and helped us to improve schemes that have been awarded planning consent. But I'm sure you'll be asking Aisha some questions around that. So that's a very practical way. But there's a whole range of other things that we do to ensure that we stay close to our community and that we listen to their voices. And it's very important, I think, to emphasise that we do everything we can to try and hear as many voices as possible. So we do have a wide range of different media and different approaches. So, for instance, one of the things that we've done for the last couple of years is we've had a very successful small grants programme, which has awarded very modest amounts of funding to community groups doing all sorts of work in the local community. We monitor that very closely, and every year we have an annual report back from that programme. We also stay very close to our community in terms of shaping our plans, because obviously OPDC, unlike LLDC, is still in a fairly formative stage, and our big strategic change projects are still very much in the planning stage. So, I mean, Emma, our Director of Planning, can say more about this, but we had a very extensive and ongoing community engagement around the development of our local plan that was adopted earlier this year. We're about to embark, just in the early new year, on a major round of community engagement exercises to start really planning in detail what the new Old Oak and Park Royal will look like. That involves, or that will involve, co-design workshops, visits around our area and beyond other parts of London, to get ideas for the way that that the community want to shape our neighbourhood. We've also got a very active volunteering programme, so colleagues in my team work with local schools, local community groups, local young people on a whole range of volunteering activities. We also, just finally, because I could talk for a very long time on this, we also have a very large business community in our area. The Park Royal Industrial Estate is home to about 45,000 workers and many hundreds of businesses. We have a close and growing relationship with that community. We support the Park Royal Business Group. We work very closely with West London Business, and we are in the process of literally going around door knocking on all of our businesses as part of our initiative called The Forge, which is our local jobs brokerage, jobs placement project, to really find out more about exactly what local businesses need and how we can help to get local people into work. I'll leave it there, if I may, because there's a lot more to say, but I hope that gives a sense of some of the things that we're doing.
So can I ask just a couple of follow-ups about how this is all sort of run and funded? You talked about the community review group for planning applications. Who runs the secretariat for that? Is it in the membership choice? Is it controlled by you, or is it more independently run by the community than that?
It's more independently run, but Emma,
Do you want to give us a bit
that?
more detail?
So it's it's run for us by Frame, which is an urban design company who, I mean, ours was the first community review group in London, but Frame do run a number of community review groups and place review groups. So it is run independently from us. And in terms of the recruitment, basically about annually we do an open advertising process to ask for people in the community to apply to be on the group, and this time round, because we weren't in COVID times, we were able to do quite an extensive going out into the public places within OPDC and kind of handing out leaflets and things. So we did actually have a really good response to that advert, and we ran basically Frame ran for us a selection process where we added 7 more people onto the group.
And
Okay.
it's independently chaired as well.
And it's independently chaired,
We
yes,
don't
sorry, I
chair
should
it.
have said that. We don't chair that. It's an independent chair employed by Frame.
And is it funded? Are the people who take part expected to donate their time for free?
Yeah, they do donate their time for free, yeah.
Would you consider changing that?
It is something that we are looking into at the moment, as well as community remuneration generally.
Okay,
If you want
that's
to
really
say
useful to
more.
know. And then you mentioned, in connection with making your new plan, that you were running some co-design workshops. Is that similarly being run by a consultancy company in a similar... I'm quite familiar with these kinds of things from other boroughs. Is that the kind of thing that's going on? Or is it, again, is that more community-led?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think I was sorry. Rookie error. First time in the new City Hall. We are working with some specialist community engagement consultants on the co-design workshop programme. So, you know, we will be very much in the front line with them, but we are getting some external support from those that have expertise in running these things. So that's the way that that process will operate.
And again, would you consider having a remunerated group of local people to support that work? I mean, we're getting more familiar these days with the ideas of things like citizens' assemblies, where people are brought together, just broadly representative of the local community, and actually reimbursed for their time.
Yeah, well, as Emma says, we are currently considering that, and we obviously pay, you know, expenses to CRG and other community representatives at the moment. We also do employ a community coordinator who's been working with us on a number of initiatives, including the Harleston Canal side improvements to the Grand Union Canal. And that is a paid role. I mean, not full time, but we do remunerate that role because they do give up a considerable amount of their time. But as I say, I mean, during the course of the next few months, we will make a decision about whether we need to extend remuneration on a more formal basis.
Okay, great. And then just on transparency itself, some community groups have told us they feel very much that OPDC is non-transparent. They get their FOI requests refused, and they feel like officers are being selective with information. How do you respond to that perception that we're hearing?
Well, I would challenge that, obviously. We respond very promptly and very positively to all requests for information, including FOIs. If for some reason there is information that we can't release, we will explain why we can't release it. We've been asked for a range of information which, for legitimate reasons, sometimes contains commercially confidential information. We, generally speaking, offer that to community organisations and third parties on a redacted basis. And we are always, and I mean always, available to meet with community organisations or their representatives. We do that in a very proactive way indeed. So, I mean, I'd be interested to hear further details about where some of these assertions come from, but I don't recognise that as the way that OPDC engages with our local community organisations.
Okay, we may have further questions for our second panel on that later.
Thank you, Assembly Member Berry. I'm going to pass over to Assembly Member Baker.
Thanks, Chair. Welcome panel, and just to declare a non-pecuniary interest, East Londoner, grew up on one side of the park, during the Olympics, lived on the other side of the park, and absolutely agree that the actual park has, is a massive asset to East London. So my questions are to Lynn and Paul about, firstly, levels of affordable housing. So can you give us an update on the levels of affordable housing on the LLDC? And will you reach 50% affordable housing?
So when you say LLDC, Ellie, I think you're talking about the land that we own within the park. Yes.
Correct, yes.
So there'll be just under 6,000 homes on that land in the fullness of time. The last pieces of the jigsaw are coming together in the sense that we're approaching the market and we'll have development partners in place. Of that, at the end of the scheme, which will be in the 2030s when everything is built out, planning permission that's already in place will achieve 40% affordable housing across that mix. And in that mix, across the whole of the schemes, 65% will be family housing, 2-bed plus, which I think is an important point to make in today's economic environment, because it's a huge plus, and that's across all of our sites. Within the affordable rented housing, and this is really important for family-sized housing because it goes to need, 83% is 2-bed plus and 63% is 3-bed plus. So a real focus on housing need and local nominations with the boroughs has been a feature of the planning permissions, which is good to see.
Thanks. Can I just dig into those numbers a little bit? So you said of the affordable rented, 8% and 63%. So what proportion of the affordable housing is affordable rented? Is it all of it, or is some of that? So can you break down the tenure of the affordable housing? That's probably easiest.
Yeah. So there are obviously a number of products. Altogether, there are 6 individual affordable products, and that's because policies and guidance from government and various mayors has changed over time. So social rent will represent around 12%. London affordable rent, which is akin to social rent, will represent just 2%. Affordable rent, which is the product that was introduced by the Conservative government after 2010, which is based on a market rent, is 4%. So altogether, there are, we call them low-cost rent, but that includes affordable rent. It's around 18% of the whole numbers. Nice. And then in the intermediate, we have 2% London living rent, which is a City Calm product. We have 15% London shared ownership, similarly. And then we have 5%, I think it's standard shared ownership. So altogether, that comes to 40% affordable of the whole, and that's how it's broken down.
Okay, thanks. I'm sure somebody will have taken those numbers down. I don't know why I was trying to take them down. I mean, we've ended up. So that's what will be once they're all built? Yes, that's
yes,
of the 40% by over the next 10 years.
Yeah, that's once it's all finished. Yeah. And of course, we've been the victim of several changes in policy.
Yes.
So between 2010 and 2016, we were working to Mayor Johnson's policies and the Conservative government. And then subsequently, we've been working to Mayor Sadiq Khan's policies, which is 50% affordable. So our schemes are mixed on that basis. The early schemes are more like 30% affordable housing, and the later ones are 50%, as you would expect, in accordance with City Hall current policy.
And does that affect the breakdown of the tenure you've given that? Is that... have you done, for instance, was there more shared ownership previously? Are you building less? Are you building more social rent now, or is it the same? How has that affected?
We've been able to move a couple of things. So in our first neighbourhood, Chobham Manor, we were able to put extra social rent into there just because we had an offside contribution from another site and we were able to boost that. So that was... a windfall, if you like. That was a very early site, and its original permission was 30% affordable and is now closer to 35%. With the later schemes, so Eastwick and Sweetwater, we've recently renegotiated the development agreement on that site and also managed to achieve more affordable housing, and in that concentrated on social rent. And then within the 50% schemes, the later schemes that are just been into the market recently, the mix there tends to be, if you look at the global mix, it's in the affordable, it's 70% in favour of intermediate products and 30% in favour of social rented products.
Okay, so it has shifted, but I mean, given the level of need, and I think we all know the pressures that you know, building affordable housing and particularly social rented housing faces, but can you just tell us why it hasn't been possible to shift more in order to achieve 50% overall?
Yeah. So when the planning permission for East Bank, which includes the university campuses and the arts and culture buildings, went to planning in, I think it was April 2018, we considered the 50% affordable housing position because there's a housing site next to the V&A. And the mayor needed to take a view on that at the time. Now, what we would have liked to have done was to have produced more social rent in that affordable mix. So closer to a 40%, 40-60 split rather than a 70-30 split, for example, or even more. What the mayor had to take into account was the financial contribution that he was making to East Bank itself in the mix. And so he considered all the remaining public sector sites in the park, of which there were 3, and the East Bank contribution in the round, and settled on a 30-70 position. We have an agreement with City Hall that should we approach the market and get better value from that land in the fullness of time, that any additional value will be skewed towards social rented housing, and some of those have not yet been tested in the market.
Okay, thank you. And on that basis, how many of those new homes so far that have been created have gone to long-term residents of the boroughs around the park, and how has this been monitored?
Well, I have some statistics on that, but not all. So all of the rented housing will go to long-term residents in the boroughs because they will go to people on the housing waiting list, and the boroughs control the nominations into those properties through a historic agreement. So everything that's low-cost rent goes that way.
All affordable rent?
Yes.
Yeah.
All affordable rent. Yeah.
The terminology.
And then the other products, the intermediate products, the boroughs maintain lists of local eligible people for those products. So in the old days, we would call them key workers, for example, people who are on lower incomes who join those lists. And London government also maintains a list. And what happens is that the registered social providers first approach the boroughs for nominations to those properties, and then approach London-wide. So I have some statistics for Eastwick, for example, where we recently completed 300 homes in phase 1. 83% of those properties went to Londoners, and 58% of the intermediate products have gone to intermediate and for sale products have gone to local people. At 58% have been sold to local people. That's the intermediate products.
And local, you mean in the
4 boroughs, in the 4
boroughs?
neighbouring boroughs. Yeah.
Okay. Right, and so you've got that for that's over all the homes in Eastwick. It's 58%. Is that
yes,
right?
We've only built phase 1 so far.
Yes.
302 homes,
yes.
and they're the statistics. Yeah.
Okay. And can I ask about jobs? You gave us some numbers on jobs. So what proportion of the jobs that have been created have gone to long-term residents of the boroughs?
Between 65 and 70% of all of the jobs in the park and in the venues have gone to local people.
Are those, so when you say in all the jobs in the park and in the venues, are those the 25,000 that you referred to previously?
No, they're a subset. So the 25,000
Yes.
is made up of the parks the jobs in and around the park and venues, the jobs at Here East,
Yes.
which I think are at around 5,500 in total at the moment. And then the rest of the jobs are at International Quarter London. Now, International Quarter London has a number of headquarters for companies that have moved from other places.
Yes, it does.
So the Financial Conduct Agency, for example, came out of Canary Wharf. We've got UNICEF, Cancer Research and so on. So they obviously brought their existing employees with them. The opportunity there is to pick up the turnover as the turnover of staff comes through from those jobs. So I don't have the proportions of local people employed at International Quarter London. I'm not sure whether we have them for Here East here today, but we can get them, obviously.
Yeah, and then the other dimension is East Bank. Yeah, that's another 4,000 or 5,000 jobs, which obviously not here yet, but... Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
The other dimension is East Bank, which is 4,000 or 5,000 jobs who aren't here yet. So do you want to say something about that?
Yeah.
Yes, and again, with East Bank, they will obviously bring a lot of their existing employees in the first instance, but they have committed to using the Good Growth Hub to get local people involved. So a number of initiatives already underway and have been for several years. Internships, apprenticeships in the creative and cultural industries that the East Bank partners run. And they are working with us to make sure that the Good Growth Hub channels in local talent and so on.
Okay, so because of course that's the key. It's not actually the park and the venues, which well, let me put to you that the spread of jobs that the ones in the park and venues are likely to be lower paid, whereas the ones in the headquarters are going to be high paid but aren't going to local people. How realistic? So, and you don't have figures on that overall, but you're going to share with us everything you do have, yeah? What guarantees or what commitments do you have from those organisations, and how realistic is it, considering that, you know, East London is still East London, that it's going to actually give long-term residents of the borough those opportunities? It doesn't just happen just because they're on the doorstep, does it?
Not at all.
No.
It's the major challenge, and it's the thing we have to want to crack. So the first thing is embedded in their Section 106, of course, for East Bank, but actually in their contract are the targets that we need them to aim at in terms of local employment and diverse employment, and also apprenticeships. So there's some numbers in there. But, I mean, you'd rightly say the fact you've got some numbers in there doesn't really help either. So we've been working closely with East Bank partners, probably for 5 or 6 years on this. I think we start from a good place with them because actually they understand they need to diversify their workforce. You know, so you've got some willing partners. You know, the V&A want to be a very different museum. UCL want to diversify workforce and students at all levels of their organisation. So I think we have we're with the flow. That's good. And then we've put in, largely through the Good Growth Hub, a number of programmes where we've piloted approaches. So I'll give you a couple of examples. I mean, one is, you know, the thing we learned, which I think is generally known, but we learned it, is when you start working with cultural institutions and cultural and creative businesses, the way you get into those is through knowing someone, often, and through your networks. And you get into those jobs through often doing an internship for 6 months or a year, unpaid. We know the people that we need to get into those jobs don't have the networks, and they can't work for a year or a year unpaid. So we invented a few years ago a program called STEP, which there's a pre-piece to STEP, which first of all introduces young people to those businesses and to the opportunities in them, introduces them to the characters, and we've been able actually through the East Bank partners to open up other parts of the cultural sector across London with some small local organisations and some large London-wide organisations, and then supporting those organisations to provide London living wage internships. So that's one example. I could give you others.
Yeah, I think I'm probably wildly running over. I'm really sorry. So, yeah, my fault. But I think it would be helpful if you could share those with us.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to pass back to the chair now before I get thoroughly told off.
Thank you. Assemblyman Berry, I'll bring you in.
I'll be as quick as I can on this. I want to talk about overcrowding, Lynn. And you'll know from the plenary meeting that I'm very, very concerned about the fact that we used to have a target for the convergence criteria to be one of the goals to be reducing overcrowding across the boroughs surrounding the LLDC area. Do you have any up-to-date new data on the levels of overcrowding in those boroughs, even though it's not one of the current targets as it was dropped in 2015-16? And are you interested in finding out more about the impact that the homes in the LLDC area might have had?
I don't have the current targets. I'm very interested in overcrowding. I come from a sort of housing background and I'm obviously involved in the Kerslake review, so I think anything we can do in this space adds value. However, I think we'll find that the overcrowding levels are huge and spiralling out of control. That's what I think we will find. And it has really forever been the case in London. We have to remember that new homes built are a complete drop in the ocean when we look at the levels of overcrowding in London, levels of people in temporary accommodation, which are well over 70,000, and that's families in temporary accommodation in London. And of course, of all of the homes built across the entire country is less than 1% of the housing stock. So never in a million years was the park going to significantly contribute to overcrowding, whatever the convergence indicators said. I think it's very hopeful, and probably the reason it was in there, Paul will know because he was around at the time, but I would guess that the reason it was in there was to make sure that when these homes came forward on the park, they were properly sized homes, 2, 3 and 4 bed in particular, so that those families that were struggling with overcrowding on the housing waiting list, or indeed on the list to be transferred, could get into those homes at the time.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, I think the recognition at the time was that anything that the LLDC could do would be a drop in the ocean, but nevertheless an important contribution. What the drive from the boroughs at that time, actually, in particular from Newham, was, regulating the private sector. You might remember Newham was sort of at the forefront of that. How do you license the private sector, and how do you get in behind those doors and deal in a very definite way? So I think LLDC building new homes of the type that you've mentioned was a part of the answer to that. But of course, the boroughs had a big role in that too.
Yeah, and we'll be discussing later the sort of new measures that you're looking at, and one of them is rent levels. But I wanted to go back to this data question, because just in answer to the questions to Assembly Member Baker, you were talking about a number of things which I think could shed some light on the impact you've had. One is your local lettings policies for the homes that have been built. You're very aware of exactly where and how the family homes that have been built have been done. And we've got interesting work coming forwards now. And this dates back right to the Assembly's work in 2011. We did a report, which is the old Housing and Planning and Housing Committee, did a report that really looked at this and said that one new large family home has an impact on dozens of people further down the line. More and more councils are trying to look at this as well to demonstrate the benefits of building new family homes into smaller sites, and just demonstrating the impact. I think you might know enough to be able to tell us. I mean, when I spoke to Jules Pipe about this at the plenary meeting, he was quite dismissive and again went 5,000 homes when there's a waiting list of this. But actually, the benefits of a family home can cascade further, and I think there is potential for your organisation, given what it knows about the lettings policies and who things went to, and the boroughs, the good relationships you have with the boroughs. You could potentially come up with a better number than just 5,000 new homes built. You could come up with a number that was people helped out of overcrowding, even if, as we know, an awful lot of other factors are pushing more and more people as a whole into overcrowding.
Well, I think that's really helpful, and it's probably something we do with Newham, where we've built most of our new homes, and certainly we could explore that in real terms with regard to Chobham Manor, which is that new neighbourhood that's now complete. Yeah, so I'm happy to have a look at that.
Thank you. Assembly Member Boff.
Well done, Assembly Member Berry. You said a lot of what I wanted to say exactly in the right way. And just hanging on to that, if I can, Ms Garner, one of the things that the report that this Assembly produced some years ago now on overcrowding says that every now and then you have to build a 5 or 6 bedroom. Not as a rule, I understand that, but doing that actually, by doing that, it's not just one drop in the ocean, it's many drops in the ocean of solving the overcrowding problem. So will you take that in consideration, that every now and then you want to build a 5 or a 6 bedroom home? Yeah, thank you. That was a nod for the record. That was a yes. Yes. What assessment, if I can say, ask now, what assessment have you made of the number of family-sized homes in the area? Have you?
Can you just unpack that a little bit? Assessment.
Well, have you looked at the demand in the area? And it looks like you have. So you may say yes, because 63% of 3 bedrooms or more, just quoting back at you, is not a bad figure.
Yeah. Yes, we did, and there was both the original planning permission in the local community scheme planning permission, which was in 2012, and then the subsequent permissions, which are more detailed. So we had an outline permission back in 2012. All of these are predicated both on our own housing policies and the Mayor's housing policies, but they also take into account the local borough's housing policies. So in Newham and Hackney, you won't be surprised to know that levels of overcrowding and numbers on the housing list are extremely high, and they have a 60-40 policy in favour of social rent. So we always take that into account in our own planning permissions. I was describing earlier the reasons why in the latest iteration of permissions for the 50% affordable, we've been unable to get to that level. And that's largely been because of the huge amount of funding that City Hall is putting into East Bank, so the whole thing was looked at in the round.
Thank you very much. And I'll stay there. I'll come in on a supplementary later. Thank you.
Okay, it's back to Assemblyman Baker.
Thank you, Chair. So, Lynn and Paul again. Have you explored the scale of the displacement of both residents and businesses as a consequence of rising property prices in the area?
We've got some information on that for you today because we had the questions in advance, of course. And, of course, there was a lot of displacement of local businesses when the Land Assembly took place for the Games. Around 200 businesses were displaced or found new premises as part of that process. The research on these businesses suggests that they fared no worse than any other business over the medium term. And some actually did considerably better. So there are a number of businesses. I have one example, which is ESG. It's a local business that's now based in Bethnal Green. They're a thriving international sports business. They've done terribly well. They helped build the ABBA Arena, and they recently worked on the London Stadium with new seating in the West End. But as I say, once we've looked at it in the medium term, and the rate of failure, say, of those businesses that were moved from the park is comparable to the national rate of failure of businesses. So we do have some statistics on that, as I understand it. We did some small displacements as a result of Victoria Wharf being partially demolished to make room for the Monue Road Bridge, which is in the submission from Just Space that members will have seen. And we relocated some of those tenants at the time. And then we have quite strong policies around replacement of businesses. So a good example is the Yard Theatre. The Yard Theatre, which is a small community theatre, will lose its premises in Hackney Wick as a result of redevelopment. But what we've managed to do is renegotiate a whole new premises to be built for them as part of the new development. And they also support Hub 67, which is a local community centre. So The yard will be back in a new premises. They're very pleased about it, and we've managed to do that through Section 106. So there's a whole host of policies that support that position.
Just if I may add to that, I mean,
Are you going to add to the displacement of businesses
Yes.
on the park's actual land?
No.
Because that's good, because that wasn't the question. So thank you, Paul.
I was going to talk about businesses. but I
So
was
the
just
question
talk-
is,
I was
just,
going to add.
can I
Yeah,
just
yeah, sure.
clarify the question? The question is, have you explored the scale of displacement of residents and businesses as a consequence of rising property prices in the area, i.e., the regeneration of the area has resulted. We don't know. So, property prices in the host boroughs have risen, frankly, astronomically. Do you believe that's related to the Olympic legacy? And have you monitored the impact on existing businesses and residents of those rising property prices as a result of the regeneration as part of the Olympic legacy? Does that make sense?
It does. I mean, so I'm not. This doesn't particularly answer the global question across the whole of the boroughs.
Yeah, I mean,
If that's what you're asking, I don't think we have.
I think we've probably got quite a lot of information on the actual businesses on the park, and there's been a lot of who were on the park. There's been a lot of focus on that, but this is really about the effect on the wider bits of East London that may have resulted, because anecdotally, I believe there will have been a large amount of displacement. Just wondering whether you've monitored that, whether you have any information on that.
No, I don't think we do have it on that scale. And to be honest, I doubt whether the boroughs have it either. I think inevitably regeneration and change and inward investment of this type, and in terms of the properties that we're building and the price point of those properties, means that more inward investment happens, and that does have an effect on local populations, and we shouldn't try to hide from that. It happens. Part of that is driven by the natural movement of the economy, and we would be fighting the economy otherwise. What we can do is try to put in mitigating measures for more affordable housing and more job opportunities, and that's what we try to do in our small way in conjunction with the boroughs. And
more affordable workspace for businesses too.
But on a really fundamental level, the legacy of the Olympic LLDC is predicated on improvements for the people of East London. But if you're actually saying it's perfectly obvious that that will mean that actually businesses and people who live in East London will be forced out, how do those things possibly stack up?
I think that we don't have the numbers and the statistics, first of all.
Yeah, but do you accept that people will have had to move out because of rising property prices?
I think there's a certain inevitability of that in any area that faces regeneration. Yeah. That's what the...
I might point out that I now live in Barking, so anecdotally, it certainly has.
I mean, it has, and it has for a generation. And
yeah. So do you believe it? So do you believe it's part?
Exactly what you did.
That's actually quite a normal thing.
This has been a.
But do you believe it's part of the Olympic legacy? I think that's the question. And if it is that something you should be monitoring and considering when we consider what legacy has been?
I think it's a part of the development story of East London, of which the Olympic legacy and London in general.
So what's the purpose of regeneration if it's not for the people of East London?
So therefore, the first thing is to try and provide homes in which people who live in East London don't have to move out of East London. And that's not always been about price point, actually. It's often been about availability of places to buy. And so providing places that people can decide to rent or stay in the area is one important piece of that, and we play our part in that, I think. The other is about, and what the Olympic legacy, I think, has allowed us to do through LLDC is to invest quite heavily in local employment and the journey towards higher skilled employment and higher wages, which allow people to stay.
I think the jury might still be out on that. Referring to my previous questioning, I think the jury's still out on in terms of how it's delivered in terms of jobs, and particularly high skilled.
Well, I mean, that's, we're 10 years into a very long journey against the background of change in East London. But I think that, and of course what you say is a risk and a challenge. Yeah. It's not a new one. Yes. But I think what one can do is to provide as many homes as possible at as affordable a cost as possible being the active word, and then support as many people as possible into the kind of employment and income that will enable them to stay and not move out as people have done for generations. Legacy is LLC is part of that, but not the whole answer to that question.
I'm sorry, I'm at risk of really running over again. So,
before you move on,
sorry,
you're going to move on to OPDC.
Yes, I am.
I mean, what I was just going to say is, I do think it's a really important line of questioning coming from Assemblymember Baker, because, I think inevitable displacement of local people under regeneration isn't something that's always been accepted as a concept or as a statement. So it is helpful to have that said quite frankly. And I think that if that is the case, then what I often find frustrating politically is the lack of methodology or the lack of indicators that allow us to quantify that movement of people and the results of it. So I'll just finish my point, and that's not specific to the LLDC. I mean, we've as a committee had this conversation more broadly when it comes to planning, and even beginning to try and evolve our planning system so that you might preempt the sort of word that's not used often institutionally, but gentrification or future possibilities of gentrification. So I think one follow-up work or piece that could potentially come from this conversation is perhaps more tools or methodologies or indicators that could be developed to measure that displacement, because I don't think anyone's doubting that some really fantastic work has come from the LLDC, whether that's housing or employment, and we've been discussing that. But it's also important, with the other hand, to be able to balance the impact that has had on local people if that has caused displacement. But Lynn, it sounded like you wanted to come back in.
Yes, please, just briefly. Perhaps I've misled the committee with regard to regeneration, because where you do control a regeneration area, then you have the ability to put policies in place that allow you to build affordable housing to the extent that you can, and they allow you to put job opportunities into the local community, and we think we've done that. But it's the inevitability, in a sense, is, and we do monitor this because we monitor income levels across London and we monitor house prices. So we know what's going on in broad contextual terms. But if I took you back 20 years to Brixton, where it was one of the cheaper places to live, it wasn't a regeneration scheme that changed Brixton. It was the nature of economic changes in the market that changed it. From certain types of housing to another type of housing. You can also look at Hackney and see how that's changed over 20 or 25 years. None of that is to do with a large regeneration scheme, because 2012 came later. What you can do in a regeneration scheme is you do have, I agree with you, tools and levers in your toolbox to be able to introduce that regeneration and put some safeguards in place. And I think we've done reasonably well in that space. Maybe there are other things we could have done, and there might be some learning for OPDC in that space. But I think we've done reasonably well. And Paul just wants to come in briefly because he's
just on methodology. Well, I mean, I've always been attracted by the sort of longitudinal survey approach. I think Newham for a number of years did a household survey, which enabled you to get into those questions, both in terms of who was moving where and why, and also their employment prospects. It's difficult for local authorities to fund those sort of things now. We've got a longitudinal survey which will run for 10 years, which we started last year, which is based on neighbourhoods. I'm not quite sure whether it gets to the sort of outcomes, answers the kind of question you want, Ellie, and I'll check on that, because it's not too late to sort of begin to change that. But I like longitudinal surveys that at a household level, actually.
Thank you. Assemblymember Baker, do you want to crack on?
Yes, sorry. Do you want me to carry on with the questions? We're just seeing whether anyone wants to pick up some of my questions, because I'm talking a lot. But it doesn't look like anyone does, so that's fine. Just to say, on Hackney, I would love to have an in-depth study on the gentrification of Hackney and the reasons for that, but I know that's not the subject for today. So over to David, OPDC. How do you manage, in the context of all that conversation, how do you plan to measure the impact of the OPDC's regeneration on local people?
Get it right this time. Well, thank you for that. So that's a really relevant question, because we're going to be looking over the course of the next few months at rerunning a baseline study, a comprehensive baseline study. One was done in 2016, I think, before I joined OPDC. We haven't done a comprehensive baseline study since then, for reasons that I can go into if the committee wish. But we're waiting at the moment for the 2021 census data to arrive, because we think that's a sensible starting point. We have done, between 2016 and today, we've done some perception studies. We commissioned a study a couple of years ago, 3 years ago I think it was, looking at perceptions locally of the area and the work that OPDC was doing, so that's useful. Alongside that, of course, we've also got some comprehensive monitoring data as a consequence of our local plan, and the annual monitoring reports obviously report in some detail on housing delivery, affordable housing, workspace, employment and so forth. So we've got a range of data. What we don't have is a rerun of the comprehensive baseline. As I say, we will be looking to rerun that in the course of 2023.
Thank you. I'm sure we'll return to that subject, the Assembly return to the subject in future years. Back to Lynn, asking about convergence. Do you think convergence as a principle worked or is working?
I'm going to ask Paul to take that, because he was here at the beginning when convergence was invented.
I mean, I think convergence really was a sort of political construct, really, of the 6 boroughs, and it was about the 6 boroughs coming together, to exercise influence over a sort of, because the Olympics can just run right over you if you're not careful, and that's what they saw had happened elsewhere, and they wanted to exert political power, really, with the mayor of the time and the government, and they wanted to be clear about what they wanted out of the games, and they were, business, homes, but an improvement in the life chances and the economic circumstances of East Londoners. So I think it was quite potent, actually, as a policy piece in getting investment from government, and channeling and focusing the investment in the games. And after the games too, the government's investment in East Bank was predicated on convergence, and in a way it was kind of the proto-levelling up, wasn't it? So I think from that purpose it was good. They chose a basket of indicators, and one can criticise the methodology and all that, but nevertheless, of its time, I think it was quite it was quite useful. It managed to track some things. Unfortunately, the boroughs under previous leadership, I should say, didn't see it through, and the borough unit that counted and monitored convergence ended in about 2016-17. There was a little bit of a carry-on through the interseason multiple declaration to 2019. We've recently commissioned PRD to look at where is convergence, and according to those indicators, actually a lot of progress was made. So if you look at household employment rates, they have approached and overcome, in some cases, the indicators that the London average. If you look at education attainment, is outstripped the London average. If you look at health indicators, that really poor progress, actually. So you can look at progress made in that way. Data go up to 2019, so it doesn't measure the shock of COVID. We suspect that the shock of COVID in the later statistics will be significant, because what we knew about those houses that were households getting into employment was that they were often, household income went up but not very much, so they were probably low paid, not very resilient jobs, and that will have suffered. And so that's what, with the boroughs, we're trying to refine the framing of the question and going forward. What I'm very pleased about is the 4 boroughs that we now work with have come together again to say, with us helping, let's begin again to take a 4-borough East London view of what is happening in our families and our households. So I think politically potent, statistically reasonably useful. Let's think about how we do it better going forward, and I'm pleased that the boroughs are up for that.
That's interesting. So just to just to clarify, so obviously you're saying you're gathering information that will relate to some of the original convergence targets as far as possible?
Yes.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yes, but it's difficult because it's some of the data and
Yeah.
it's on 4 boroughs, not 6.
Yeah.
So there's a
It'd be a bit of a mismatch,
poor
basically.
read across. But I'm actually we're pleased to share with you what
Yeah,
PRD are finding.
I think that would be great. And so I think you sort of hinted towards it, but is there? Apologies, Chair. What was that?
I think we're going to have to move us on. Assemblyman Barrow, I'm going to bring you in.
Chair, I realise we're like at the end of the time we were allowed for this session, and what I wanted to do was
I think we'll be extending it by 10 minutes and cutting it from the final.
well, I was just going to make a suggestion that what I wanted to do was to interrogate this presentation, which, to be clear to everybody watching, is the Inclusive Economy Board presentation of a new sort of framework. And I wonder if there's some very specific stuff about the environment that it's just going to take me ages. So I'm just wondering if maybe we should, I should write a letter and then feed it into the committee's work.
Yes, if that's okay.
Because otherwise we will get into
I
knots
agree.
about how the environment is reflected in this, and it's really hard to it'll take us ages.
That would be, I think, most appropriate.
That would be really helpful and timely, because this, as you can see from the presentation, is in the process of formation. So that would be great.
Exactly that. I think it's good to get something, and
Good
maybe
moment.
writing it down is easier and to
Please
digest.
Yeah,
Yeah,
please.
that would be
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you. Assemblyman Barrow, did you want to ask your question number 10? Okay, that's fine then. So I'm going to move you on to Assemblymember Best.
On that note, did you want to also include 11?
I think feel free to ask some of the questions you were hoping to come
I was
with,
going to,
because we're going to
because I
extend
can
the
move
panel.
on to. Okay, well, so morning. I'll just ask. Can you provide an overview of the plan for both the transition of powers in 2025 and the Growth Borough Partnerships inclusive economy work?
Yes, I'll start, and Paul will pick up because he's the strategic lead for what we know as transition. The planning powers go back to the boroughs in December 2024. This date has been mutually agreed, and we are working hand in glove with the boroughs to deliver that. There are several challenges. Obviously, we need to get data, IT systems aligned, local plans aligned, and so on. So there's a huge amount of work going on, and we also need to tackle talent movement, because we employ a lot of talented people at LLDC who will otherwise be without a job at that point in time. The broad strategic approach has been signed off by the Mayor of London. That will see a residual organisation left behind. It will still be a Mayoral Development Corporation in the sense that it will be under the Localism Act, so we're not moving to a different successor body. It will have much smaller geography and much smaller governance. So we're shrinking to the park itself, which is essentially the land that the Mayor of London owns and controls directly. And we expect it, all to be happening at the end of 2024. What will that organisation do? It will be maintaining the park and venues at the standards we would expect, and that's part of the inward investment strategy to make sure that new jobs keep flowing in. Although on the inclusive economy side, we will be taking a strategic lead only. We will be very, very short on resource at the Mayoral Development Corporation level, and we'll be relying heavily on the boroughs to pick up that activity. And some of our presentations on inclusive economy that Councillor Barry was talking about go exactly to the heart of that, and working hand in glove with the growth boroughs to make sure that can happen, and we got the right resource in there, but also with East Bank partners and academic and Here Eastern business partners to make sure that the mantle is picked up for inclusive economy by others, because we will not have a huge regeneration team that we have now. We'll be cutting that right back. So looking after the park, having a strategic focus on inward investment, and thirdly, we will be managing those joint venture partnerships that still have 2,500 homes to build on the park, and making sure that they're built out to the quality and expectations that we would expect. But the development functions will be shrinking as well, so it'll be a kind of a governance job sitting on the boards of joint venture companies.
Thanks for the overview, Lynn. But I think could probably agree that it's not something we're going to be able to get into the meat of in 10 minutes. It requires its own scrutiny, doesn't it, this plan? Perhaps it's worth coming back at a later date, I think, in some form with the planning and regen, either informal briefing or through a committee, or as we get closer to that.
Happy to do it.
Yeah. So I agree. There's probably more to say, but I don't think we're going to be able to get into the meat of it. And Lynn and David, as you look across to OPDC colleagues, what in your view can they take from you guys as lessons learned and things to the biggest lessons they can take from what you've done to apply to their work?
I think we highlighted a few things in this space. And the first one, and in many ways I think the most important one, is to stick to the vision, essentially. Keep the vision at the centre of your mind, but really have the humility to change direction when things are not going as you would expect, to achieve that vision. So these are huge projects. They are 20 to 30 year trajectories, and things change, policies change, things get in the way, viability exercises and so on. I think one of the best decisions we made was not to build housing on the East Bank site, and to instead bring two huge university campuses and an arts and culture focus there in that largest investment in East London since the days of the Great Exhibition. That's going to make a huge difference for decades to come to East Londoners in terms of ambition and opportunity, particularly if we get the programming right with those partners going forward. But it was a tweaking of what we were doing to make this a whole place and not just dominated by housing. But it sticks to the original vision. I think that's one of the most important things. We've moved towards joint venture delivery as opposed to a development agreement. We think it gives us more control and a seat at the table in terms of how schemes are built out. And we've been sometimes frustrated with the speed of delivery of housing on the park, not only because of things that are uncontrollable like COVID and so on, but because of viability concerns from the private sector partner. So if you can be at the table and controlling some of those conversations, we think that's a good thing. We do deeply reach into communities, and look, this is hard work and it takes a lot of time, because in these places that we're developing, David and I, there aren't a great many communities, and you're building new communities. So you're having to engage with people outside of your immediate area, and that can be challenging in a whole new development context. And then lastly, I'd say that we've had a dedicated resource in Paul's team in regeneration and community partnerships, and we've done a huge amount of work in that space, and we've applied a lot of budget to it, which means we've got strength in the socio-economic side of the business, and I think that's served us extremely well over a number of fronts.
And you mentioned communities there, and actually when I was looking at some bits before this meeting today, I went to see the Chobham Manor development strategy, and on their website I was really sad actually to see that the tagline on there was one of London's most vibrant new communities, and you kind of just alluded to the new communities then, because as Assembly Member Baker said, you know, he's grown up in East London. There was a very vibrant community there. There was and it felt, and it feels a little bit hard to take when, you know, to see something like that saying a new community. And I accept you don't write those marketing strap lines, but how, taking that forward for OPDC, can they avoid getting into that feeling where it feels like a community is being taken away, and it's all about the new community and not about that existing community? How do you protect and safeguard that?
I think it's a good point. I mean, I suppose in the area where the park is, QEOP, the vast majority of that land was occupied by business interests and some bits of wasteland and so on, some waste sites, not by housing. And the existing communities tend to be outside the park area. And it's about knitting in the new with the old, I think, which includes connectivity via bridges and so on and so forth, to make sure that people can get across the railway lines and get across the water and feel part of that community. So there's a piece of work for us to do there. So very few residents were displaced as a result of the Olympics. It is a new community. Of course, I said earlier that there's around 35% affordable housing there. That affordable housing will be occupied by people who live in East London. Now, I don't have the statistics with me, but those nominations, both for intermediate housing and social rented housing, go to the boroughs. So the strong likelihood is that at least 40% of that housing is occupied by people who have lived locally. And then a further percentage will have bought the new homes. So whilst it's a new community, that's not to say that it hasn't got residents living in that community that have always lived in the East London area.
Can I just, I take your point. I mean, one thing is to be more careful with our language. And I think, if you lived on the Clays Lane estate, there will be some people before the games, there was some people who look at that and actually feel hurt by that. I think there are the steps one has to take to try and integrate what our new buildings, let's say that, and old buildings, and make them one community. Just the sort of one little thing that we've done in that regard with where we've built schools is always build them on the edge and build them early, so that the people who attend those schools come from the new buildings and the old buildings for one community, because communities built the school gates, as you know. So I think you make a good point, actually. Be careful about language and then take practical steps. Absolutely.
Thanks, Paul. And just what lessons can be learned on transparency? So the LLDC didn't publish its housing strategy report at its investment committee meeting in June 2022, and I don't believe it had published it before that, and citing commercial confidentiality for the reason for not publishing that publicly. But when a journalist FOI'd that, they were provided with that information, but with just a small redaction. So I know you'd released a press statement on why that is, but to me that didn't quite stack up, and I think there could have been a way to be slightly more transparent about that information when first asked. Is there perhaps a lesson learned for you, but also a lesson learned on OPDC on how to better share that information?
Emma, I'd need to take that away in terms of the particular thing that you mentioned there. But in general terms, I totally agree with you. Making something confidential for one small redaction is something that we ought not to get into, and we need to be more transparent in that space if that's what's happened.
I appreciate the frankness on that, and I hope that it's something that can be taken away, because, like I say, it just builds, reduces trust for no reason. If it's gonna be released under FOI anyway, just share it in the first place. And just briefly, if I could come to OPDC, to you guys. I wanted to ask a question. We had the point earlier around the need for 4, 5, even 6-bedroom houses. What proportion of those size homes do you hope to have within your schemes?
I'll ask Emma to come in a minute as Director of Planning, but we have a planning policy of mixed housing. We want to see a target eventually of 25% of our homes being 3-bed plus. I'll admit at the moment we've not hit that target, which doesn't surprise me, frankly, given some of the issues around where the project is. There's quite a lot of homes being built at the moment. There's quite a lot in the planning pipeline, but we're not currently at our 25% target. In terms of the very large homes that the committee was discussing earlier, I'm very clear that there is a need for those. We know that they're very expensive and difficult to build in the London housing situation. They're very expensive in terms of grant and so forth. But I think, as we develop our plans, and particularly as we hope to get more control over the development process by achieving a consolidation of the public land holdings in Old Oak, which is really the key, I think, to delivering a project where we can expect to achieve some of the things that the committee has been raising this morning. If we can get to that position, then I'm confident that we can build a wide range of housing. It will be quite high density housing, there's no doubt about that, but we want to have a civilised level of housing density with a range of family and smaller units. But Emma, you might want to say something about what your current position is in terms of both planning policy and delivery.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that David said. I mean, we've got a target for 25% of homes to be family homes, and at the moment we have delivered more than 50% of our affordable homes as family homes. There's no doubt that there is a need for the larger family homes of the 4, 5 and 6 bedrooms. As David said, there are, you know, some challenges in delivering those, but I would see us delivering some of those as part of the larger sites that would come forward on public land, and that there would be pockets of housing like that within those schemes, and that's what we will be pushing for on the planning side.
Assemblymember Boff, did you want to come in after Assemblymember Best if you had some more?
I've got.
Yeah, you continue. And then I'll bring
it might actually be. I know Andrew's question is really quick. And I've got one more.
This is extremely quick. Will you undertake to read this committee's outputs from its investigation into building typologies, and then write a response back to us on that?
Yeah, of course we would. I'd be really happy to do that.
Thank you.
And just one final question, sorry, Chair, was when we came to visit you a few weeks ago, we watched that marketing video, and the Mayor said in there that you were seeking financial support from government. Could you let us know how much support you're seeking?
So yes, we do think that we will need we'll certainly need a funding strategy to deliver our plans. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, the key to really unlocking strategic regeneration in our area is the consolidation and control of the very significant government land holdings that are currently in the ownership of the Secretary of State for Transport because of the construction of the High Speed 2 station, and additional land and assets that Network Rail may well be looking to release. And if we can find an agreement with government to consolidate those land holdings, then we will have the ability to bring forward a development scheme in a comprehensive way, which will be between 75 and 100 acres of land. So that's really the key to it. The reason I mention that is because the consolidation of the land and the agreement that we're working towards with government to secure that land has a very direct bearing on the funding strategy and your very specific question. Because to boil it down to simplicities, there are effectively, I think, 2 ways that a funding strategy can come together for our plans at Old Oak. One is to secure control, possibly even ownership of the government land holdings by paying for them in a, if you like, a kind of cash transaction up front. The other way, of course, might be for the public sector and the state to invest the value of that land at day one into a partnership deal, a joint venture type deal along the lines that Lynn was discussing a few minutes ago, with a view to that being a long-term investment stake and to take value as the development matures. If the latter route is taken, then our assessment, through the work that we've been doing with government colleagues over the last year or so, suggests that we could potentially achieve a funding strategy that does not rely on large elements of government grant. It could well be achieved through a combination of the investment of the land value and possibly some loan funding or other recoverable investment. So that's really what we're working on at the moment in what we call the outline business case, which, as I say, we're working very closely with government colleagues on, and we will be submitting to government formally, hopefully for approval, in the early to mid part of next year.
So is that the latter, is that your preferred route?
Well, I think that's a matter for the outline business case to determine. There will be, I suspect, options in that report. It's really a matter for government to determine because it's their asset.
Sorry, I'm only pushing because of time, but so you haven't taken a preferred route or asked government specifically for to support or finance one route at this point?
No, we're talking to the. I mean, we are talking to government about the options. I think it's fair to say that there would be a preference from the government side for a strategy that doesn't rely on large amounts of grant because recoverable investment and loan finance is obviously a lot easier, generally speaking, for government to fund than large amounts of grant at a time of fiscal austerity. So I think that would be our preferred option if we can make that work.
And just one final question before I hand that on you. The £250 million government grant you already had to hand back, do you have some sort of safeguard learning in your back pocket to make sure something like that doesn't happen again?
Yeah, very much so. We probably haven't got time to go into the detail as to why the application for the Housing Infrastructure Fund grant was not achieved. I'd be very happy to have a longer session with the committee on that, but we've certainly got a strategy now that does not rely on the assumptions that were made at the time the earlier strategy was put together.
Well, I think it sounds like as you come towards a preferred route, that conversation might become more necessary as well. So thanks.
Very happy to come back and share that with the committee.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to our guests for their contributions this morning. I think there's been a variety of follow-up, but one I just wanted to make sure that we did nail down, which is, Lynn, hopefully some kind of follow-up with the LLDC around specifically the inclusive economy work. Obviously, I know we were hoping to be joined by Rokhsana this morning as chair of the Growth Borough Partnerships. I think actually it's quite fitting that we'll probably have a follow-up conversation with the committee, whether that's formally or informally, so thank you for your agreement to that. And many thank yous to both our LLDC and our OPDC participants this morning. We'll be breaking for a 5-minute adjournment whilst we switch over to the second panel, and then there will be a closing panel for about 10 to 15 minutes so that we can tie together the themes between the two. So I know that Lynn will be losing you, but I think we'll be retaining the rest of the panel from this session. So thank you very much again for your time, and we will resume in 5 minutes' time. For the guests for panel number 2, if you could come to reception, it'd be great to come and organise you for the chamber. Thank you very much.
this one, and they'll go red, and then when you're finished.
And continued good morning, not the afternoon yet. Welcome back to those who are joining us online and those in person. Many thanks again to our guests from panel 1 who have stayed and are in the public gallery in order to help us draw together any themes that come out in panel 2, which I'm sure there'll be many overlaps naturally, with closing remarks for our final panel. But welcome to our second panel of guests. Thank you for joining us, Aisha John, member of the Old Oak Park and Mayoral Development Corporation Community Review Group, Lucy Rogers, a community speaker from the East Ends Trade Guild, Myfanwy Taylor, the research director from the Bartlett School of Planning, and Professor Tony Travers, visiting professor of the LSE Department of Government and director of LSE London School of Economics. Thank you very much for being with us this morning. Apologies as well, we're running slightly late, but hopefully we'll catch up time by reducing the final panel a little bit. So feel free to ease into your answers. There's no rush with this panel. I'm going to kick us off by starting with a question to Tony, Myfanwy and Lucy. To what extent do you feel the Olympic legacy has positively impacted communities in East London 10 years on? And perhaps I'll start this way with Tony and move that way with Myfanwy and then Lucy. Welcome, and yeah, please.
Well, first, thank you for inviting me, us, no doubt, I can't speak for everybody, to come and give evidence to you this morning. I mean, I think it's almost impossible fully to disentangle the impact of the Olympics and the enormous investment in infrastructure that went with that, and the clearance of the Stratford Railway lands and surrounding areas that occurred then, with what's happened subsequently. But what I think we can say is that I think London has been at the better end of a spectrum of efforts after an Olympic Games to follow through, to deliver something in the longer term, and certainly to avoid problems that have occurred in the past, perhaps the more distant past, of stadia that were just built for the Olympics and facilities that were created for the Olympics and never used for anything again. So I think that the political decisions that led to the creation, not just of the original authority to deliver the Olympics, but the subsequent post-Olympics LLDC, were the right ones, given, and we may come on to, I have sort of qualifications about development corporations, or at least explanations that beg questions about them. But I think that the determination on the part of both government and the LLDC to ensure that we didn't end up with what had once been derelict land and railways and things becoming just a sort of an empty area after the Olympics, and to follow it through was the right thing to do. Now, I know you've been having a session earlier about what was and what hasn't yet been delivered, and in fairness to the earlier witnesses, they were part of the session I heard, willing to accept that not everything that they were hoping to deliver would have been delivered, but then that's the inevitability of all government in London at all times. So just so to come back to your question, I think that having a legacy that was thought through and planned, or at least planned and then in part thus far delivered, was better than just leaving it and hoping for the best, which is a very British way of doing most things, I might add, but not on this occasion.
Thank you, Tony. Myfanwy, did you want to contribute as well? And Tony, I just need you to switch your mic off afterwards. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think in terms of the question, I guess the starting point is very much what the panel's been grappling with earlier, to do with the framing of legacy and convergence. I think, they're not really fit for purpose concepts unless they can incorporate a concern and appreciation of who is benefiting. So, what benefits, if any, did the businesses and the residents and the other community organisations that were present in the area before, what benefit did they have? And as I understand it, there hasn't been the sort of longitudinal research, the investment, despite all the billions of public investment, there's not been the investment in the research that would allow you to actually understand whether and how those groups have benefited. So I think in that context, the concepts are entirely not fit for purpose. I mean, a big issue, again, that's come up already is that they take no account of displacement, which in the case of the London Legacy Development Corporation, of course, the whole thing was predicated on displacement. It was not, in fact, a wasteland. There were over 286, I think, businesses in the park, providing over 5,000 jobs. So any account of legacy must take that displacement into account. There was some loss of housing, community housing for gypsies and travellers as well, which was lost to and of value to those families. I think when, taking account of the new development on the park and the surrounding areas, of course, one can do the analysis, and I know many researchers have looked at this, as well as clearly the LLDC as well, looking at the portion of genuinely affordable housing delivered, i.e. social rent. We're talking about really actually being really rather low. I think if you were looking at this now, you would be expecting significantly higher proportions. So I think not a great performance there, or certainly not one that we would recognise today. And I think if you look at the reprovision of commercial workspace, my understanding is that the rents for the new workspace on the park are very much higher. They're actually more comparable with office rates in the area rather than the sort of typologies that were present before. We can go into all of this in more detail, but I think that failure to account for displacement, who is benefiting, East London, the boroughs of East London have obviously transformed radically over the last 10 years and the preceding 10 while the Games was in planning. So just looking at sort of the performance at a borough level is not really going to account for those questions of who benefits. What else to say? From my perspective, I think there probably has been a missed opportunity to collaborate more substantively with existing residents, businesses and community organisations. I think both at
in and around the Olympic Park and with the Old Oak now, you know, there are residents, businesses, organisations that have put sustained effort and energy into attempting to engage with these organisations, with trying to influence the local plan, with trying to develop their own community plans and neighbourhood plans, you know, with hours and hours of their own volunteer time. I think it's a great shame more of them are not present today, and I know there's a lot of concern amongst the neighbourhood forums and associated groups in both areas that there was not a greater opportunity to be present today. So from my perspective, there is a need for a further panel on that, and perhaps speaks to a problem there, a missed opportunity for greater collaboration that I think the Old Oak Development Corporation would be wise to learn from. And in terms of, you know, your question about benefit, who benefits, is there a legacy? I think resourcing that collaboration was something that was missed. So in a sense, it's lucky that, you know, Just Space and other organisations were able to mobilise specific sources of funding to support people to have a say, and they did. That was essential. That would not have happened without that work. But I think it's a great shame that there was not some funding set aside to resource and enable that. And indeed, in terms of lessons learnt, you know, I think there is such a strong desire to engage and to contribute to the future of these places that I think it's great this review is happening, but I think there needs to be a much more equal conversation with local organisations if one's to talk seriously about legacy into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Myfanwy. Lucy, did you want to comment on this as well?
Yes, sure. So I'm speaking on behalf of the East End Trades Guild, which has its 10th birthday today. Also, I was part of the Save Hackney Wick campaign at the time. I remember going to a presentation by some architects near the time that the Olympics was given to London, and they had a diagram of the new Olympic area, and they were calling the areas around it the Olympics fringe. And I thought that's really quite insulting to those places that have been there for years. And I think in a way that's the sort of attitude, that this big behemoth, rather self-important, massively funded thing came in, drew the red line around itself, and everything else was suddenly its fringe. In fact, when the LLDC was given those fringe areas as part of it, you know, I think there was that was the start of a lot of tension, which when they were given those outlying areas to actually look after. The LLDC did at least afford us the possibility of having an EIP for the local plan, which was able to, so people felt they were contributing to that. Because, of course, this development corporation is essentially a gigantic opportunity area. And, you know, Just Space has a very, has always had great concern about the opportunity areas, as you know, because of their lack of transparent formal plans. So at least the LLDC had one of those. That was a benefit. Even though much of what the local people contributed was ignored. I mean, one member says at the local hearing, local plan hearing, I pointed out to that the LLDC had failed to include any reference to the policy requirement to meet the needs of the existing population. So I think that the tension, as I say, has been present the whole time. And in the Save Hackney Wick campaign, that was very apparent because, for example, when you asked to get some statistics about who had been consulted and what the happiness value was of the people in the LLDC area, they just gave us information on the Olympic Park and actually not the mainly residents living in the Hackney Wick area.
Thank you, Lucy. I'm going to move us on and bring you in, Aisha. I know that there's probably a lot of lessons that we'll be taking away from today, but in particular, if you wanted to apply any of those to the OPDC in West London and the lessons that can be learned for this regeneration project in terms of community engagement and your experience thus far with OPDC in that regards.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm an original member of the OPDC. I got into it purely by accident, actually, and it's been a slow labour of love. Working with OPDC has been exciting, actually, as a community person. Very engaging, very open, very structured. They have been, very open with us and engaging and allowing us to have our say, have our voice heard. And our voice has been heard on many occasions, and there's quite a few different projects that have come to us, and we have stated we don't like this, we don't like that, it won't work for the area.
Excuse me, could you speak a little closer to the microphone?
You can bring it forward, you can pull it forward.
It's fully
Is that better?
Thank you so much.
Yeah, maybe just pull it down as well a little bit.
Yeah, there we
Perfect.
go.
There we go. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's been a joy to work with OPDC. We've had lots of different projects come to us, some that we've liked, some we haven't liked. I've always felt that I've been listened to. I've always felt that the projects have been well put together, that have been presented to us. I do think there is more opportunity to engage more with the wider community, especially because we are sort of trying to do this, living and industrial working side by side. I think more can be done in respect to what's going on around the Park Royal industrial area and how they are engaged with. I think there could be more done with the youth around the area, because they are going to be taking on the baton from us in 10 to 20 years. So I do think there needs to be more engagement with the youth. I think there needs to be more engagement with smaller communities like the travelling community, who at the moment are stuck in between a rock and a hard place, and it'll be quite upsetting if their voice is not heard, because they do bring a lot to the area. So I've over the last 4 years, I found that engaging with OPDC has been quite easy, and I would love to see what we have with our community review group. I would love to see it rolled out into other communities, into other boroughs. I think it's a really good opportunity to feel like people are being heard, and especially with our review group, who's very diverse. Like, we have such a diverse group of people, and I think that's really important, the diversity, especially in an area like Park Royal, which is very diverse. But I do think there's opportunities to broaden our engagement and make sure that we are tapping into each background, each community that's there. And I think sometimes as a community person, you kind of feel that your voice maybe won't be listened to. You slightly feel that, oh, that's a bit over my head. And I think we need to sort of change that sort of perception that, this is only for a certain person to be engaged with. This is about, your area. So, I'd like to see much more sort of tapping into that.
Thank you. Assembly Best, I'm going to bring you in.
Thanks. Aisha, if I could just stay with you for a second. And that was quite, I think, flattering of OPDC. I think they'd be happy with that conclusion. So that's good. Before this meeting, I think all members of this committee were approached by Old Oak Neighbourhood Forum, who raised significant concerns about the OPDC model and its approach to regeneration and consultation. And I think they made slightly different conclusions, or came to slightly different conclusions. They put to us that there should be a full review of the OPDC and whether it's an appropriate delivery model. that a series of planning consents had been proved to be premature decisions, and that the planning committee arrangements had not delivered democratic decisions with more appointed members than local councillors, and the quality and communication work being concerning. But are those concerns that you would recognise, or it sounds perhaps like you wouldn't? I'm not sure.
They're not really concerns that I think I would, or as the group, that we sort of have any sort of involvement in, really and truly. But as you said it, I think there's probably an opportunity for us to be more engaged with that aspect, and if that's possible, that'd be great. If we can have more engagement, maybe a bit more, you know, sort of openness when it comes to that aspect.
That sort of comes on to my next question as well, about being open and transparent. Is there any ways in which you feel that that OPDC can be more open and transparent with the community, or tangible things that perhaps we could recommend happen?
I think one of the things that I think that could help is earlier engagement. Which sometimes, things are done and they're sort of at a point where it's just like, how much can we really influence? So I think much more earlier engagement and a bit more openness, a bit more openness about what's going on, how it's going on, why it's going on. There's lots of questions that, like, as a community we have, and sometimes they're not particularly answered. Example, I know HS2 is kind of a separate entity, but it's not a separate entity because it's a big entity in the whole area of things, and it's not, HS2 hasn't really engaged with the community review group, and it's a big kind of nail in our side, really, because it's causing quite a lot of contention down in Park Royal. And I think we'd like to see more of a group effort, not just OP, but just like a group effort, maybe more sort of engaging between OPDC and all the other little subdivisions that are there, because at the moment it slightly feels a little bit disconjointed, and that not everybody's singing from the same hymn sheet.
And specifically on the local plan, do you think that enough was done by OPDC to engage with local residents there?
Not at the beginning, and there still could be done more. I mean, there's things going on, and there's lots of different other organisations within the area that kind of have no idea what's going on. When we've had planning meetings and stuff like that, there's a lot of us a bit like, well, we didn't know about that. That wasn't told to us, or we live literally right on the doorstep and we don't know this. So I think there needs to be much more public engagement, and a lot of them haven't really engaged and let the community know exactly what's going on, and I think that's what's really, really frustrating. And another thing that's, I think, quite frustrating is the liaison between, the different sort of projects. It seems to be, again, very discombobulated, and there's sort of things happening at the same time. Like, have you talked to one to the other? Like, one building might be built in January and another one in March. Have you thought about the traffic? Have you thought about how that's going to look around the area? There's a lot of stuff like that that's been going on, and so it's sort of making people's life a bit difficult, and and then it sort of makes it very difficult to get people on board, because they've already sort of taken up, this isn't going to work, they don't want to and it just then feels like it's been done to us. We're not part of it, it's been done to us. So just think there needs to be this much more open communication, much more open communication.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And so turning to Lucy Myfanwy, and more on the LLDC now, but similar questions. Do you think that, Lucy, I'll come to you first. Do you think that LLDC have been open and transparent?
Well, I think that there has been this problem that exists in the OPDC as well, which is that the committee, a planning committee, is mainly based on property interests, and the local representatives haven't always been very strong on those committees, and the fact that the organisation itself is pulled in two directions, being a planning authority and taking development control decisions, which are normally thinking about local needs and policy. But then when they own the land or are partners in private schemes, that's a conflict. And that means that often things like confidentiality comes in. And I think that causes the lack of openness sometimes. For example, if you want me to talk about the Hackney Wick issue, the reason that we think that they were completely intransigent about these bridges was that there was a private agreement with the Sweetwater developers that just couldn't be turned around, and we were never given that information. And in fact, the committee looked into it as well and wrote and came up with the fact that there were unanswered questions. So I think that does take place, yes, the lack of transparency, because there's so many commercial operations going on within the planning part.
Thanks, Lucy. Myfanwy, did you have anything to add to that on openness and transparency?
Yeah, thank you very much. And maybe I'll also just clarify a bit. Some of my more detailed research was around the Carpenter's estate around like 2012 to 2015, when there was a community planning process emerging, and then also in support of the Newham network to kind of engage in the process around the first LLDC local plan. So I think on your specific question, I mean, one of the issues was to what extent the LLDC was willing to support and encourage and collaborate with the community planning group, which became a neighbourhood forum. So there was a really, this was the Carpenter's estate, owned obviously by Newham Council, a large council housing estate that had been listed for redevelopment since 2003, and already process of decanting of residents, as it was called inhumanely, begun, from then. But really the remaining residents really strongly wanting to remain, like identifying as a strong settled community that valued their estate, that valued their parks, their green spaces, their school, their community facilities, and the local businesses there too. So, despite all of the uncertainty and the difficulty, a really strong desire to remain. And, I think one of the positives was the LLDC being initially supportive of the neighbourhood forum. But what happened was, it got really a long way along the line. It was designated, the plan went to consultation, but I think in parallel, Newham Council's, under the new mayor, Rokhsana Fiaz, was, progressing by then with the master plan. So then, and the funding that had supported the neighbourhood forum ran out, and there was no intervention by either the council or the LLDC to kind of continue to resource this. So I think that meant it sort of fell by the wayside. And I think, of course, the Newham master plan is not the focus here, and certainly is much improved in many ways in terms of council housing and refurbishment first on some of the buildings and stuff. But I think there was an opportunity missed to engage with the broad alliance that had formed in the community plan. So on your question of openness and transparency, I went recently to the estate and went round to talk to all the businesses that, 8 years on, many of them are still there, like amazing, with all the uncertainty. They're still there, they're still committed to the area, they still want to stay. Do they know what is intended for them? No, they do not. You know, some of them have had vague conversations, some of, you know, they've had to go knocking on the door. They've found the LLDC, some of them more responsive than the council or popular. But, you know, when you do the digging online and you actually go through the hundreds of documents as part of the master plan, you see there's actually really quite a lot of detail worked up on what will happen to existing businesses, who sort of is suitable and therefore will be re-accommodated, and who is not suitable and therefore will be found other premises. The businesses themselves have no understanding of this at all. And I think, you know, there was one of the long-standing family firms was available to come and speak to the panel today, but I think there wasn't space. And that, I think, you know, speaks volumes, I think, because they have the direct experience of all the issues the panel is concerned with. So I think it's more than openness and transparency, it's collaboration and partnership where there has been opportunities missed. And I think, just to draw a comparison then, to look beyond the Carpenter's estate, you know, when I did some work working with Just Space and the London Tenants Federation through the Newham network to support businesses and other organisations to engage in the very, very demanding process of shaping a first local plan for the LLDC. Like, really important work, like 13 businesses and organisations represented, and we're saying basically, we are here, like, please engage with us, we want to be a part of this area. And they gave all sorts of, you know, very relevant and important contributions, unfortunately none of which were acted upon. But it was interesting that the LLDC had done some very good studies of the local economy, like a quantitative study, a qualitative study, case studies. Like, shining out of this was such a strong picture of a strong local economy, a strong industrial local economy. But so all the businesses had been surveyed for that work. They had not been treated as sort of part of the future of the area. They'd just been surveyed, and that was like the end of the story. So it's that, you know, coming back to them, they've built their businesses here. They're part of the local economy. Like, is that all that happens, that you get included in a study and then you see the plan, and, you know, if you're not a new developer or you don't fit the vision, then that's it. And I think there are lessons to be learnt for the OPDC, and I think, you know, it is important to note that the Old Oak Neighbourhood Forum, the Grand Union Alliance, they wanted to be here today, and I think they were under the impression that there would be space for them to talk to the panel, even though the remit had been narrowed. And I think there is some repair work to be done there, probably, to enable them to have their say as the work of the committee proceeds, because, you know, I think the Grand Union Alliance actually predates the formation of the Old Oak Mayoral Development Corporation. Has been active since 2014, and I think around 50 groups have been taken part in their activities in one way or another, so I'm sure they have very relevant views to share. And I think there is some frustration again that the opportunity of neighbourhood planning was not more broadly seized by the OPDC, that perhaps, you know, larger neighbourhood forums could have been conceived of and more proactively supported. So I'll stop there. Sorry. Thank you
both.
Did you want to come in with 17? No, I think that's also been covered, hasn't it? Yeah. 18, I'll bring Assembly Member Boffin.
Ms John, you've heard what Ms Taylor has been saying about the experience over on the Olympic site about displacement of businesses. Has displacement of residents and businesses been a concern during the regeneration project at Old Oak Common?
Yes, massively. I think because we're not just having businesses and family homes, we're also having students in as well. A very vast amount of students. And, you know, in the first panel, there was the word thrown around gentrification. And it's, you know, I think a lot of people are worried about it. I'm worried about it. I'm worried about, you know, my son not being able to afford to live in the area that he was born in. And I just think, you know, you've got to be mindful when you're bringing in a whole new different way of life into a already pre-existing way of life. And
thank you very much. It's not so much that, it's not about the effects of gentrification. It's more about the fact that people are going to be moved out and businesses are going to be moved out. Is that a concern?
That is very much a concern.
Do you think that the OPDC is doing enough to mitigate this and at least involve people, perhaps at an earliest, those businesses in discussions?
I think they could do more. I think they can do more. I think there again needs to be more engagement, but I also think as well that some of, you know, I know a lot of these companies do a lot of, you know, surveys and the rest of it, but I think they have to simplify the language in a lot of these surveys and a lot of this, because there is a lot of context out there, you know, there's lots of context out there, but is it accessible for everybody? And I don't think it is. And I think that's people not really understanding what's going on and how it's going on. And I think then it needs to be a simplify or a jargon buster or, you know, something where people actually feel that they can, there's not so much of a wall up, you know, that they can access this information, they can actually get involved, and it doesn't feel foreign or it doesn't feel, you know, a bit above them. You know, because it's quite daunting when you think about like planning and all of this. It's very daunting. It's things that people have really never really thought 2 minutes about. You know, I didn't. When I first came into this review group, I just thought it was a review group of people. I had to learn a lot. I had to really get my head around stuff, and it is quite confusing and it's quite daunting. I mean, this is quite daunting, you know. So
we're quite friendly.
I am. Oh. But no, I do think there is a big worry about, you know, being able to sustain, you know, and, you know, Park Row is a very small place and it's very dense. It is very dense. And, you know, I've worked there, I've lived there, and it will be a shame if we couldn't incorporate what we've already got there instead of always having to start again or, you know, feel we have to start from the beginning again. I just would love to see the building on what's already there. And I think, yeah, it is scary for a lot of people. It is really, really scary.
I was on the Assembly back from 2008 when we were talking about the plans for the Olympic Park, and I can remember residents coming up with exactly the same comments. So thank you for that. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Senator Berry.
Thank you very much. I wanted to go back to actually providing resources and support to local communities to do engagement. When we spoke to the previous panel, they said that your group was donating their time for free. Is that correct? And how much time do you think you've donated for free?
So yeah, my time's donated for free. I mean, I've been here from the beginning. So yeah, a lot of my time, and you know, it's not just the allocated time, it's the time outside that where, you know, I might pop down the canal to see what's going on, or, you know, check up on this or check up on that, or drive past something and get out of the car and have a little butcher's and see what's going down. So, you know, I think to be a review member, you kind of have to throw yourself in it a little bit. You know, you kind of have to sort of keep your eye on what's going on. And yeah, so there is time, and, you know, I would like to be paid for it. That'd be lovely. But at the same time, I'm a champion of my community, and, you know, I'm more than happy to do this for the greater good. So, but I think if you want to get the, I don't know, like the gold dust of community review members, you know, I think, or anything in this sort of remit, it, you know, preferably, you know, a not voluntary basis, but
So are you also tasked with trying to sort of encourage other people to join in when there are, because apparently there's annual recruitment drives. Do you think that the lack of remuneration impacts the ability of people, for example, to give up paid work to do the activities?
Yeah.
And impacts the diversity, the range of ages, the kinds of people who might have families who can join in?
Yeah, I think it definitely does. I mean, we've been lucky and we've been blessed that we've got such a diverse, group of people. But at the same time, I've done other voluntary stuff, and it's very difficult because, it's people's time, and it's always in the evening, and so it kind of becomes a bit difficult, and when you sort of pay for something, you kind of get a bit of a better, like a better outcome. But then I think to do this, you have to have a love of your area, you have to have a love of your community, and I think a lot of that comes across in our group.
Great, okay, that's really, really useful feedback, thank you. If I can turn to Myfanwy now as well, because you made some comments earlier along these lines too, and I think the example you gave was the neighbourhood forum in the LLDC area that ran out of its neighbourhood forum funding, but was a ready-made group that LLDC could have stepped in to keep funding. Am I right about that?
I think it's a bit difficult to speak on their behalf, and it's sort of one of the reasons that I think, it would have been nice to have the neighbourhood forums here themselves to speak directly. But my understanding is, these things don't just sort of pop out of nowhere. The Greater Carpenters Neighbourhood Forum was rooted in the Carpenters Community Plan, which, sort of came out of residents' various efforts to kind of engage with the regeneration plans for their estate going back to the early 2000s, and a lot of work was done to bring groups together around the community planning process when UCL, my own university, was actually planning to flatten the whole, well, I think the plans were there to flatten the whole estate anyway, and they would just be what went on top of it. But, that sparked this community planning process with people saying, well, no, we want to have a say in what happens in our area. And it's a wonderful document. I think, the committee could look back at the Carpenters Community Plan, and you see then there was so much work to bring people together around a neighbourhood forum and to go through the very lengthy steps involved to be designated and to do all the technical work, and even to submit a plan that was validated and went through to consultation. And I think, there would be questions for Newham Council and for the LLDC as to what then happened, why that plan was never adopted. Of course, Newham Council is proceeding with the master plan, but as I was saying before, I think the broad alliance that formed around the community plan and the neighbourhood forum, perhaps, I haven't had the opportunity to spend enough time digging into this yet, but the businesses are not informed. They do not feel informed. They've had one letter in the post. Some of them have had some conversations. Many of them have no idea. And these are people that have been waiting for the future for 20 years by now. And when there were resources in place, I should stress, like independent resources through Just Space and the London Tenants Federation that are extraordinarily adept at doing sensitive, careful, workshops with local groups to bring people together to support them in their direct voice, which is why I'm uncomfortable to speak on their behalf. Yeah. It's about the direct voice of the community, and it's very important. Obviously, the community review panel also sounds important, but it's important for the committee to understand that has a different function to a sort of bottom-up initiative, and how the LLDC, indeed how councils, how the GLA can engage properly and partner equally with those sorts of bottom-up initiatives is a really important question. And resourcing has to be part of the conversation, and questions of who is being paid and who is not are essential to questions of who is benefiting and who is not.
So I'm not asking you to speak on behalf of individual examples. You're here to talk about the structures, and these are just illustrative. And you're right that if we want to hear about the exact issues, we do need to speak to those people directly. The other example you gave was just space, how essential it was that they were able to bring resources in to boost community engagement. But again, should this resource not have been available? And so are there lessons that you can talk about today from your sort of academic point of view that would demonstrate to OPDC, who now face this opportunity, that this is good value for them to invest this money in these kinds of engagements?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think what's been called for a long time, and it's not rocket science, is resourcing for community networks to enable local people, local businesses, local organisations to sort of engage and represent themselves effectively with the local state or the development corporation, whatever it may be in that place. So I think that has been a clear proposal and request for a long time, and I think should be absolutely mainstreamed into any initiative. I mean, in terms of the value that can produce for the GLA or for councils or for development corporations, I mean, you know, if there is a genuine concern for existing residents, existing businesses, existing organisations to benefit from, to be a part of, to be present in order to benefit from, as a starting point, what comes next, then, you know, it would seem essential to enable them to actually be informed, as Aisha has mentioned, to have the basic information, which itself, you know, takes an incredible amount of time and care and skills. You know, to resource people, to support people, to have access to that information as a very first step, you know, to then be able to come together to consider it. What does it mean for me and my family or my business? What do I want to say back to these organisations, and how do I do it? You know, and in what terms and in what language? All of that is work, takes incredible time and care and skills. And, you know, and as Aisha is saying, it's like very interesting as well, like, you know, wonderful to now be an expert in planning and development. So I think if, you know, what I'm hearing is inclusive economy is kind of the new policy frame for what comes next. You know, and it's obviously linked to community wealth building, which I know Newham has got a community wealth building strategy. You know, for councils and metropolitan authorities that have those kind of goals, it's a non-starter that is absolutely in keeping. And you know, you could very easily build in a monitoring framework to identify the benefits that would come from such an investment. A very simple survey. People would be, as we've already heard, gaining new skills, gaining information, being you know, feeling more confident, more trusting, as well as then, you know, actually what comes out of, you know, we would hope very much that you would secure a better outcome in terms of housing that's needed, community facilities that's needed, and local economic activities that are actually connected with the skills, the experience of local people, which we heard in the previous session. Sometimes that disconnect between what comes in through inward investment and what it is possible for people who were here before to access. You know, so if you're able to work in a more bottom-up, locally rooted way, those job opportunities can be much more closely connected to where people are right now, and supported with community organisations that are experts in connecting people up to training and jobs. So I think you know, especially with the large, you know, the large intention, the large activity, the large investment that a development corporation is, this is an absolute, you know, this should be the first thing on the funding list.
And probably a bargain in comparison. Just finally to Lucy, did East End Trades Guild ever get any funding directly from the Development Corporation? And does it still, in fact, if it did?
For what?
Well, to support your engagement with them.
I don't think so. I do not know. I can't answer that. I don't know.
Would you be able to check and get back to us? Because I'd be very interested to know if there was anything.
I mean, I don't believe so. I know that just the same situation as is being described at Carpenters, all the businesses had a really difficult time. keeping in contact with each other and knowing what was going on. But actually, I wanted to just say, if you look at the salaries of the LLDC, they're huge. I mean, the top salaries, if just a fifth of everybody's massive salary at the top was diverted, say, you know, it's a really interesting question. What would somebody want to be paid to just turn up one evening? Is there a figure we could put for that to that? I think the money can be found, really. And actually, if the LLDC was moved on, there will be a lot of money saved.
I'm going to move us on to Assembly Member Best.
I was just going to hand it back to you, don't worry.
Yeah, and just before I do that, I'm just going to bring Tony in on this question, because I appreciate, Tony, you've not had a lot of space to contribute yet on the panel, but just in regards to this question around resources that MDCs can use to provide local communities to kind of enhance their engagement, if you had any thoughts you wanted to offer the committee.
Well, I mean, I think listening to this conversation, much of what's been said is just true of all planning and all local development. So the UK model, the England model of development, heavily relies, particularly in London and the South East, where land values are high, on capturing uplift and spending it locally. If you want an example of how it can be done, Battersea 9 Elms. No development corporation there. Had to pay for tube line to make the site viable, rebuilding the power station. The government could have paid for all of that out of taxpayers' money, but they didn't. So the model we have, particularly in London of development and regeneration, relies upon heavy involvement of the private sector and private capital, and of course that does take you from time to time into confidentiality issues, which I realise never feel very good if you're on the other side of it, but so there's that issue. So there's second, on the issue of consultation, I'll come to the question. Consultation, I mean, consultation is such a dismal word, because it's everything from being sent a letter to tell you something that's going to happen by a public authority, through to focus groups, and there's a whole range in between. So I think the extent to which consultation is done or not done, well or badly, by these development corporations, all I'd say is it can be done worse. If you look at High Speed 2 and Somers Town as another model, and not one I'd follow personally, because there's no structure really. They're just the council trying to deal with HS2, many of whose board papers are heavily redacted, so you can't see what's going on at Euston. And then there's the issue of planning documents. I'm sure that the development corporations' processes are not that dissimilar from local governments. I have to say, as a user, I find planning documents almost impossible to understand. You just get huge amounts of information put into documents, which have to be as they are for statutory reasons, but it's not going to be very accessible to anybody who isn't a planning expert. So the point I'm sort of making is that, of course, you could empower local people more, perhaps pay them to go to meetings, though I think the idea, I mean, the sort of conflict of interest problem would soon rise. If you start saying, well, the development corporation should pay members of the public to go to their meetings, I think somebody would then say that compromise them. So the question is then, should the government again pay? And a lot of this comes down to, why don't taxpayers pay for lots more than they do? And the answer is because they won't. Because government won't, national government won't, City Hall doesn't have the money, boroughs don't have the money. So I think that many of the challenges that the development corporations throw up in terms of public access and so on are ones that are not unique to them. They're simply an artifact of the way we do development, the way we do planning, and the way we do consultation.
Thank you, Tony. Assemblymember Best.
Thanks, Tony. And I think that was probably the background and context for my question. So I will ask if you can keep this to a simple yes or no, pretty much. Do you think the Mayoral Development Corporation was the most effective way to deliver regeneration in East London?
I can't quite do yes or no. I was always rather wary about development corporations back in the LDDC days, but in the end, and particularly for areas of the kinds we're discussing here, which are on borough boundaries. I mean, the point came up earlier about being peripheral, which I agree is not or at the margin. But the truth is, borough boundary areas, and both these development corporations have this challenge, are never very well planned. It's just an artifact of being on the boundary. There are sort of good political reasons for the edges of areas getting less attention than the middle of an authority. It's not unique to these sites, and it's not unique to these boundaries. So I think that, although I'm personally a bit wary of development corporations as a concept, I can see why, on occasion, they're the least worst way of doing things. I mean, I don't think, you know, if the Olympics had been delivered by the normal London means, it wouldn't have been ready for about another 35 years. So on occasion, you do have to have the use of compulsory purchase powers, the use of government money in a targeted way, and all the things that happen to deliver the Olympics. I don't think you could have done that by other means.
Thanks, Tony. And to be honest, I think that was quite what Lynn Garner of LLDC was saying, quite frankly, earlier, that the corporation existed more to mitigate what would happen already, as opposed to saying we're not going to, you know, be able to stop all displacement, etc., etc. And I think that plays into your phrase around the least worst way. So with that in mind, is the Mayoral Development Corporation the best answer for regeneration in Old Oak and Park Royal area?
Well, the difficulty that that development corporation has, and others know more about this than I do, is that it's almost entirely reliant on generating money through development. So it's not like the Olympics Authority that had, you know, huge amounts of money to spend. This is a very British way of doing something. Draw a line around an area and then hope that somehow property development can pay for, you know, as I said, 9 Elms, the building of a new tube spur off the Northern Line was paid for, at least in part, by developments. And so actually I think that development corporations probably give you a more articulated and thought through answer than just allowing it to be. Now, there's another counterexample, King's Cross. Now, King's Cross took a very long time on a similar kind of site, and the results there, though they're criticised by some people, you know, are, I think, very different to Battersea. So you get different results in different places.
Sorry, I think there's a mic issue.
You're not hearing me?
I think we've lost
No,
you.
it's on, but it seems
It's
to
on,
just
yeah.
gone. Can you bring it a bit closer to yourself, Tony?
Right. Is that any
there we
better?
go.
All right.
Back on.
Okay. So I was just saying that if you compare the development corporation model here, I suspect that the results, despite the criticism, which I totally get, that people have about, you know, feeling it's hard to get access, so I think a lot of that applies to local authorities as well. You've got other models to compare it with where you don't have them, and I'd say Battersea 9 Elms is a really interesting one to compare it with. Is that a better way of doing it? You've asked that. Sorry, what? No. I mean,
So we're saying we're not
all
using
King's
questions,
Cross.
but
we
back
ask
to us.
questions.
Sorry.
Assemblyman Baker, I think you have the final question.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realise you were still going.
I'm not, but Myfanwy wants to.
Yeah, thank you so much for noticing. I just wanted to offer a comment on that because it hadn't come up in the questions that were previously addressed to me. So again, I think this is something that if the Grand Union Alliance or the Old Oak Development Corporation were here, Old Oak Neighbourhood Forum were here, they would want to say. But I think, you know, in evaluating the outcomes of MDCs and thinking about learning from the LLDC to the OPDC, one of the things is around, you know, as Tony was alluding to, the kind of land value capture mechanisms that in Old Oak are of real concern because of the lack of land, the lack of funding means the organisation is almost entirely reliant on Section 106 contributions to resource any sort of social outcome, let's say, whether that be affordable workspace or schools or play space for children, which I know is a major issue. So, you know, my understanding is that, you know, the Neighbourhood Forum and the Union Alliance are extremely concerned that this model is producing very poor outcomes for local people obviously pushing intensification and densification in itself might not be an issue, but they're concerned with what is being delivered through the Section 106. They're concerned with some key infrastructure being pushed off-site, play spaces, for instance. They're concerned about actually quite poor levels of genuinely affordable housing as a proportion of the total being delivered. So, you know, I think that model is really in crisis at Old Oak, and I don't think that's an overstatement, actually. And the lack of access to information and deliberation around how Section 106 contributions are being used, I know is a particular area of concern for groups in the area. And I think it beggars the question as to, is this an appropriate thing for the mayor to be engaged with? Is there public benefit for continuing in this model, really? We know London's property markets are wildly overheated. We know displacement and gentrification are absolutely running through the city with terrible consequences. You know, is it not time for a rethink, actually, of this model? Because I think the public good is in question here, if we listen to what groups on the ground are actually saying, and if inclusive economy and community wealth building is nowadays more the frame, you know, there are alternatives there. I think, you know, having a session with groups that could actually look like what they feel is needed in their area and how they would like to work with the mayor in these important areas is a really critical question. You know, because I don't, it does feel that it's a different situation to the LLDC. There isn't the massive injection of cash coming there, and it is a real concern, this use of the Section 106 as the main funding mechanism for any public good from a wildly overheated property market. So I did just want to take the chance to get that.
Yeah, SMM Baker.
Sorry.
Yeah. I'm just conscious we are running the committee over time now.
It's really one-time thing, just because I think it begs the question, given what you just said to Myfanwy. So, do you think that the model needs a large-scale review at OPDC?
Yes.
SMM Baker.
Thanks, Chair. And I'll try and wrap up and keep it short. Although I think that Tony Travers' comments on the place of the MDCs in the wider system, that is sort of like a bigger example of what goes on everywhere, is I thought was really helpful. And also when we are relying on, as I say, the sort of skimming off of private sector development and the rise in land prices to fulfil the social aspects of it, it feels to me, to be honest, that is always going to come into conflict with proper consultation and control of local people. So I think that's another big sort of underpinning of it. But again, as I was saying earlier on, you're not supposed to be asking us questions, and then I just give my point. So my final question is about the transition of planning powers back to local boroughs. And Tony, I'm wondering whether you've got any thoughts or concerns about how that might go.
Well, I mean, one of my original concerns about the original Docklands Development Corporation was that it did vest in that, and it was much less open than these corporations are, a lot of planning powers, which were in the end handed back to the boroughs in fairness, but it took really quite a long time. So I think they should be handed back at the end, and that's always the intention. But can I just go back to the point, if I may, about your kindly remarks about what I'd said, which is that, I mean, we have to be a bit careful what we wish for here, because the government is consulting on the future of SIL. And there are people in government at the moment who like to keep SIL on Section 106, but take more of the money away from London and give it to the rest of the country. Okay? So we could have all of this development, but less money spent locally. That would seem to be fair to many people in other parts of the country. So you could develop East and West London and then spend the money in Barnsley. That would be fairer, wouldn't it? Well, no, it wouldn't really, would it, for the people of West London? So we have to be a bit careful. Because it happens to be the way we do it. We could, as I said earlier, we could have a different model for doing it, where the government paid for everything, But then you'd have to get Michael Gove in and ask him to pay for it all. My guess is he won't come and he wouldn't give you the money anyway.
Thanks. Yeah, that's helpful to put it in
I'm
context.
not having a go at Michael
No.
Gove, who I think is rather a good minister for the avoidance of doubt, but that's another matter.
Whole different subject. I'll pass back to the chair. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think what we want to do now is we want to try and bring together the guests from the first panel to this panel, because I think, as you can probably have seen, in order to try and give all participants as much space as possible to contribute, we did split it over 2 panels, so that it didn't feel like there was this internal conflict. But I think it'd be good to have some reflection on what's been offered. So if the members from the first panel who would like to join for closing remarks, it would be fantastic to have you come down now. I think by magic you will jump over the glass.
No jumping over the glass. Don't want anyone injured.
I think for the members on the current panel, if you're up for staying exactly where you are, that'd be fantastic. So to the guests joining us, yeah, take a moment to settle in. But I think what we're looking for in this section, I think, is a response to what we've heard, but also for you to be able to tie that in with any closing remarks that you have from your perspective. So I'm not sure if Paul or Dave wants to lead off on that. It could just be a simple situation where we go this way along the committee, along the panel, sorry, so that we can sort of also get some feedback as we go along. Does that work for the panel? If we start with yourself, Dave, and Aisha, it'll be great for you to also feed in any closing comments after Dave, and then we'll move along this way around.
There we go. Well, look, I listened very carefully and I thought it was a very interesting discussion. I think my reflections at this point, and we could obviously spend the rest of the afternoon unpacking what we've heard, is number one, I'm very clear that there's a massive responsibility and obligation on organisations like MDCs to take transparency and engagement very seriously. That goes without saying, because we are in the business of looking to transform whole parts of our city, and that comes with a huge obligation to make sure that the people that are going to benefit from that genuinely do so and feel that they're part of the process. That means that we need to take transparency seriously, and that means that we need to work hard to gain the trust of the people that we're working with. And I think trust is the most important thing here. I think the second observation I would make, and I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, is that, you know, the business that we're in is not an academic exercise. It is making hard choices sometimes about getting things done on the best possible terms. And I think, I mean, I'd very much concur with Tony's kind of concluding remarks, really. You know, there was a time when efforts to regenerate our cities were done differently. You know, the state would fund very generously, and mistakes were made at that time as well, of course. And some of those mistakes we're living with today and are having to untangle as we regenerate again. But nevertheless, the fact is that we do now operate in a world where the public sector has to work with the markets, and it has to work with private investment. And if we don't get that private investment working quite hard, then we're simply not going to see change happening, and we're not going to see the benefits that we can capture from that process of private sector investment. So there are hard choices. I've got no doubt about that. I think the third observation I would make is that, you know, in the context of what I've just said and what Tony was saying about the need for us to work in partnership between the public and private sectors and with our communities, it is important to recognise, and I think, and maybe this is a more parochial point about OPDC, but there are some community some community-based organisations that simply do not want to see development happening at the scale and pace we need to deliver those community benefits. And that's perfectly understandable. And it's perfectly legitimate to hold a point of view that says, actually, we don't really want this process of change that you're talking about and the Mayor wants to see. I respect that, but it's very difficult sometimes to engage in a fruitful conversation if every single step of the way there is a fundamental objection to every single thing that is being done. Now, I don't take the view that that is the view of the majority of our community. It is the view of some people in our community. It's not, I don't think, the view of the majority. And that's why we really enjoy working with people like Aisha, because, you know, Aisha, as you've heard, is happy to be a critic, but we regard her very much as a critical friend, someone who wants to engage, who wants to help to shape the future, and will keep us on our toes and challenge us to do better. So I just want to sort of log that, because I'm not pretending that everyone is going to agree with us every step of the way. They're not. What we're looking for are points of engagement where communities genuinely feel they can influence outcomes. But there are going to be compromises, and there will be one or two bumps along the way. I think that's inevitable.
Thank you very much, David. Aisha, I don't know if you wanted to offer any closing remarks as well.
Yeah, I did. Again, thank you for having me here. I think the Community Review Group has an amazing ability, if it's used correctly, to maybe be the glue between point A and point B, with, you know, the local authority or whichever, and the community. And I think I would like to see community review groups used in that fashion, as the glue, as the sort of that go-between, because I think it will just, sometimes things kind of come better from your own, if you get what I mean. And I think sometimes when there's not that go-between, that person in the middle, it just feels like you're being talked at. You're being told, you can't, you da-da-da-da-da-da. And I think, again, I love my review group. I love what we're doing. And I really, really, really like to see actually work and not just be a scheme for the moment, it to be rolled out actually as a permanent thing, because it's actually, when you look at it, quite a unique thing to sort of happen. And I think this will help to sort of get the trust of the community. You know, the reason why the community don't trust all these big developments, because there has been a lot of mistakes, and all we're seeing is just like, well, yeah, you said that about the last thing, and look how that handled, or, you know. So I think going forward, we really do need to put into this community review group, into other little, you know, whether it be housing, whether it be private sector, whichever. And I think it'd be very useful, but you just got to use it properly, and not just have it there as just, you know, saying you're liaising with the community, just, you know, for fanfare, but actually, you know, back your talk and, you know, actually start to engage this into, you know, actually planning, because, you know, then you'll start to get people will start to think, oh, you actually want to hear what we want to say. You actually want to take us seriously. We can do this as a collective, you know. So, yeah, that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha. Emma, I'm inclined to move on to Lucy if Davis summed up from OPDC, unless there was something you felt wasn't covered that you wanted to add.
I was just going to say a little tiny bit about planning, if that's okay.
Please.
So I was just reflecting on what Tony said, and, you know, planning is really complicated, and it is really hard for people to engage with it. And 28 years ago, I actually started my career working with communities, helping them to get engaged. And I know that we can always do more consultation, but reflecting on what we've done at OPDC, I think we have actually done a lot more consultation and engagement, and better engagement and consultation than I've ever seen done anywhere else that I've actually worked. But, you know, my door is always open to discuss how we can do that better. And we are going to be consulting on a statement of community involvement in the new year. And I'm interested in having more conversations with the community about what they think we could do better.
Thank you, Emma. Over to you, Lucy, for any closing remarks.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I don't really agree with the slightly being painted as part of the group that wants nothing ever done. You know, wants nothing ever done. I don't think that's correct at all. I think it's how you do it. I mean, David, we were on the same side a long time ago over the Bishopsgate goods yard, where we wanted something different done with that site, which was very special, and a good outcome could have been achieved with private and public working together, and that's what we were trying to do, I think. So going back to the actual, and Tony, you know, let's not just accept that it goes on like that, so it should go on. Let's try and do it differently. And if you go back to the good old Fish Island, where all those businesses and artists were hanging out, I'm sure Paul is going to say that was old a long time ago. But when you look at the area of Fish Island now, you've created a monoculture where there was a complex organism of people. And I think when we talk about asking for the public to be involved, what we're saying is the public actually know the place they live, and they know what works and what doesn't, and what's a benefit and what isn't. And we're simply saying those people should feed into what happens next. And actually, it is good practice, and it makes better places, because when you walk around bits of the Olympic site and park and Fish Island, and it is extremely monolithic, as oak, as old oak is going to be, or is starting to be. And is that really where people want to live, and really is the investment worth it? Would the investors not like to build things that people like? So I just think we should just remember that the consultation aside, and that we're talking about, we're representing people who don't have any power at all, but just get things done to them. We just want to be involved for that reason, not just to have a say for the sake of it, but so we can get places better and fairer decisions as well.
Thank you, Lucy. Myfanwy.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to the committee. It's really important work that you're doing, and the conversation is valuable, I think, in itself. So yeah, I think it's also probably a mischaracterization to sort of place things in dual opposition to one another, like it's either partnering with the private sector to get things done, or it's the state doing everything, which is in the past, which we don't have now. Like that's a very simplistic narrative that places, you know, you're either with us or against us, you're for us or against us, and you know, I don't think that's a great basis for collaboration. I think you know, how public benefits are captured from the London property market is a very tricky question, given where we are right now, and I think it's a legitimate one to be grappling with together, and to be asking ourselves what is the role of the mayor and the GLA and the resources and the powers? What is the potential of these powers and resources today? Because we might get a different answer to that question today than 20 years ago, when actually a lot of these things were in emergence. We now have inclusive economy as a driving strategy. We have community wealth building, especially in East London, as a really important strategy. So I think we might find, you know, we don't just need to stick with how things were. 20 years have passed now. London is different, and the challenges we face are very, very different, and we should be open to rethinking things, especially where such serious problems have been identified. The evidence is overwhelming on the legacy and the convergence record, and I would encourage the committee to look to the UCL Legacy Conference. 2 days of absolutely overwhelming evidence was presented there, and that ought to be more than enough reason to think again and be open-minded. And I do, you know, my experience as an academic working in collaboration with community groups, precisely in the intention of trying to get things done, is that this is their incredible an incredible area of innovation and creativity, and thinking about how can we get good outcomes for ourselves and our families and our wider community. They're not NIMBYs. There's a gross mischaracterization. They're people, you know, giving up their free time to come along and to try to make a better place for themselves and their families and their communities. So I would encourage the panel, the committee, to look at the Carpenters Community Plan, at the neighbourhood plan, and to hear directly from the neighbourhood forums. You know, they're doing their best to contribute to this agenda as well. I do think there is a specific chance with the Carpenters estate to make sure all businesses are included, to make clear commitments there, and probably as well with Park Royal, clear policy commitments that everybody is able to remain, that everybody is included, and to build into any future organisations like upfront policy commitments for inclusion, targets and monitoring, because, you know, the evidence is overwhelming. They can't be set up like this again. I think that's clear. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Myfanwy, and we'll certainly be passing on your recommendations. We'll get them sent around the committee, and also the Grand Union Alliance and the Old Oak Neighbourhood Forum will be touching base with them after the committee to get their contributions. So thank you for raising that with us. Paul, closing comments and remarks.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, thank you for your questions and the discussion of both panels, which I found really helpful personally. Thank you very much. I suppose one conclusion, I think, slightly echoes what you've both said, which is that we are worrying about the same things. We have similar critiques of the way things have been done. It's just that, you know, we express them in different ways, and you know, it'd be surprising if we had to find the answer. We need to work ahead. I think from the earlier discussion, you know, these kind of really big, important questions about what's the population level impact of some of these interventions, and I think one of the things you were saying in your submission is that convergence wasn't particularly good at disaggregating the effects of different things. So I do think that this session that we've thought about with the 4 boroughs and ourselves on thinking about an inclusive economy and reformulating this would be good to have with you. I think it's a sooner rather than later thing because it's in a process of formation. I think Myfanwy would welcome a conversation with you about that so that we can see that. So that's the first thing I would say. So I should have said I was going to say 3 things. That's one. Sorry? Okay, I'm not shouting enough. The second thing is, I spoke earlier about the really quite extensive network of relationships that we have with local community organisations and local businesses and local residents that we work with. I think I stressed earlier on, Sian, that, you know, these include some people who do it for love, but actually people that we pay and that we commission to do research and have that kind of input, a mixture of them, and organisations that are delivering practical activities and programmes on the ground. My suggestion is when you visit the park next, and I hope you won't be long away, is actually you spend more time with them and less time with us. We don't need to be in the room, and I expect you'll get some rough and some smooth from them. And I think that might be helpful because you'll get a sense of them. And that brings me really to the third point. Well, no, actually on that, I would say what I find quite thrilling actually is when you do meet those organisations who are really leveraging the benefit of what's happening for themselves and for the communities that they serve. It is that Olympic spirit. This is happening. How do I grab hold of it? And I think there's an interesting spirit in East London and our part of East London at the moment that comes not out of us actually, but out of those communities. Brings me to the third point. I was going to say I've read 2 sorts of things in this 10th anniversary year over the summer. One is there's been a number of books and publications that talk about, you know, from a position of almost, they're not us, but they're almost unqualified support for what's happened. And then I read The State of the Legacy, which you mentioned is the report of that conference, isn't it? And on the one hand, the positive ones, sort of very positive ones, say, here's the government and City Hall and LLDC, and they've done all this to the area. And incidentally, there are these people who are against it, but they don't really matter. I think they do, actually, but that's what it says. I find The State of the Legacy is a similar sort of thing, in which it's a sort of the government and the City Hall and the LLDC have done this stuff to East London. We're not sure we much like it. And incidentally, there is these people who are against it, and what they say is really important, which it is. But for me, they both, interestingly, come from the same place. What I miss, and it's partly because of my own background, in the area and in local authorities, is what does this all look like? Actually, if you are a local authority, or you're a community anchor organisation, or you're a community organisation, and here you see this wave of development coming towards you, and you think, am I going to sit here and get squashed by it, or am I going to look into it and see how do I leverage benefit for the people I serve if you're a local authority, or how do I leverage benefit for the community anchor organisation that I run and that as a community, and I as a member of a local community, how do I make this work? And that story I think almost never gets told in the midst of all of this. I think it's part of what you'll get if you speak to local people in the area. So is this kind of, these people do stuff and we either like it or don't. I just find that frustrating personally. I want the story about how do you, if you're in a place, make sense of and seek to change and seek to leverage benefit from big development waves. And I think if we could have sort of a bit of analysis of that, then that will stand other communities in good stead when they see the wave of development coming towards them. So I hope that's helpful, Chair, but I found this a really helpful session. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. And final word to you, Tony.
Well, at the risk of saying something that's very, very obvious, I mean, a lot of the issues that we're discussing this morning take place on sites, often large ex-industrial sites, which mean that the burden of the consequences of densification and change are generally borne by lower income households. Because, if you live in a nice settled area with lots of Georgian housing, you'll never see any development because nothing can be touched. So there is an equity issue buried in all of this, which I know everybody kind of gets, but it's worth restating, I think. And it does explain, I think, why often people, we've heard voices this morning and there are many more, why people feel they're having things done to them, because at some level they are. So there's that. So just say that. Beyond that, on the convergence point, which I haven't really said anything about yet, and I know the Assembly is, the committee is interested in, I mean, I think it's, development and the model that I was describing earlier, which we all understand, can only do so much. And if we shouldn't be, one shouldn't not be ambitious for development, but sort of hoping that development of an area, be it at Stratford or at Old Oak and Park Royal, can somehow change. Now, I'm not exaggerating for it, but change the life chances of everybody all the way round, given all the other forces raining down on them at any point, not least of which is a recession. We have to be careful not to overpromise and underdeliver, would be my view on that. And then last but not least, on the model of the Development Corporation, which, as I've explained, I was never massively comfortable with, though I've slightly come to terms with over the years, and this model of development, if you look in the spending review and what the Chancellor announced in the autumn statement, the amount available for infrastructure investment and the kind of things we're discussing here is going to go down in future years. It will be taken down, reduced by inflation, the costs of development, and separately because there'll be less government investment. So the model we're discussing is going to be, one way or another, whether it's done through development corporations or by boroughs or in other means, is going to be the one that carries on into the future, I suspect, assuming the economy fully recovers. And therefore, the kind of issues you're discussing do need to be got right. And I think the voices we hear on both, I don't want to say both sides, but you know what I mean, sort of those who are trying to manage the development and manage the planning system, and those who live in areas and feel they're having things done to them, which they often are. Sort of getting that right is more essential even now than it would have been 20 years ago.
And the committee couldn't agree more strongly with you, which is what we have attempted to try and do through the curation of this committee. As you can see, it's been quite complicated, but I actually feel like this closing panel has helped bring it a lot back together, which I'm really grateful to all the panellists for sticking around till the end to make sure that we could actually bring things together. And I think there'll be a lot of follow-up, because MDCs are gigantic areas of governance, and I think we've only really just sort of started to get into the meat of this conversation. So we'll be in touch. There'll definitely be follow-ups, and a huge thank you again for your time and your expertise. And before you rush off, if you could just give us a minute to wrap up business so that we could avoid the noise. But I would want to really reiterate my big thanks on behalf of the committee for your time this morning. and afternoon. Okay, committee, can we note the report on today's discussion? Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output from the discussion? Can we note the committee's work programme and the additional activity undertaken since our last meeting, namely the site visit to Old Oak and Park Royal? The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 12th of January 2023 at 10 a.m. in the Chamber City Hall. I have no urgent business, so I will be closing the meeting now. Thank you very much, everyone.